There is a shed under a mountain, and the mountain is called Lee. And the shed has a roof of thatch and a floor of beaten earth, and it is more than 2,200 years ago. The evening is cold in the way that river valleys are cold, which is to say damp first and cold afterwards, so that the cold arrives in the sleeves before it arrives anywhere else. Straw smoke hangs at head height under the thatch and does not leave, because the smoke hole is small and the wind tonight is smaller still. There is a smell of wet river silt in the shed, and beneath it the flatter, chalkier smell of clay dust, and beneath that the faint, sweet smell of millet steaming somewhere in the next building over. A lamp burns on a low bench. It is a shallow dish of oil with a twist of fibre in it, and it gives about as much light as you would expect from a shallow dish of oil, which is to say enough to work by if you have been working by it for years. A man is finishing a soldier. His name, or the name he pressed into his work, was Gong Chang. We do not know what he looked like. We do not know whether he was tall or short, whether he was patient by nature or only by training, whether he had children waiting in a village or a bed of his own in the workman's town. We know only that he was careful, because carefulness is the one quality that survives in fired clay, and his has survived. The soldier standing in front of him is the height of a large man, a little taller perhaps, and he is the colour of nothing at all just now, only the soft biscuit grey of clay that has dried past wet and not yet met the fire. His arms are on, his hands are on, his head is on, luted at the neck with a smear of slip, and his face has been gone over stroke by stroke with a small wooden tool until the eyebrows are the eyebrows of somebody in particular and not the eyebrows of a category. Gongchang turns the hem of the clay robe toward the lamp. It is a low fold of drapery at the back of the leg near the ground, in the place where a hem goes and where nobody looks, because nobody in the history of the world has ever looked at a hem on purpose. He takes a small stamp from the bench. It is a thing about the size of a thumb joint, and it carries his name, and he presses it into the soft clay of the hem with a single unhurried push, and lifts it, and looks at the mark, and does not admire it, because there is nothing there to admire. He is not making art. He is not making history. He is complying with a regulation. Somewhere in a ledger there is a rule about this, and the rule has consequences, and he has met the rule, and now he can go and eat his millet while it is still warm. And in 2,200 years, on an ordinary working morning, in weather he could not imagine, in a world he had no word for, a person will kneel down in the dirt beside that same hymn with a soft brush and a low light, and clean away the lowest of 22 centuries, one gentle stroke at a time, and read his name. That is the whole story of tonight. That is all of it, really, and we are going to take about 6 unhurried hours to get there, and there is no rush about any of it, and you do not have to stay awake for the ending, because the ending is already in the room with you. So, let us settle in. Wherever you are, whatever hour it happens to be where you are, whatever sort of day you have just put down, this is the part where you stop holding it. Let the lamp grow dim, if there is a lamp. Let the screen dim too, if it will, and turn it away from your face, because you will not need to look at anything from here on. You only need to listen, and in a little while you will not even need to do that. Feel the small weight of the day slip down from your shoulders, 1 quiet inch at a time. Not all at once. Nothing tonight happens all at once. Let the jaw unclench, because the jaw is always the last to be told. Let the hands go heavy. Let the breath find its own slow pace without any help from you, because it has been doing that for your entire life, and it does not, in fact, require supervision. If you enjoy what I do here, and only if you truly enjoy what I do here, you might leave a like on this video or press subscribe, and that quietly helps other tired people find their way to this small dim place at 3 in the morning. And if you would like to, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It is a strange and lovely thing to scroll through in the daylight, that long column of sleepless towns and quiet hours, and it helps other people who cannot sleep find their way here and know that they are in company. That is all the asking there will be. From here on it is only the story, told slowly, in a low voice, for as long as you need it. Now, you have probably heard the loud version of tonight's subject, because the loud version travels well and the quiet version does not. The loud version says 700,000 slaves worked to death in the mud under the whip. It says that every last one of them was massacred when the work was done, sealed alive into the earth in a single night so that no living mouth could say where the treasure lay. It says that their swords were plated with chromium by some lost magic, a technology 2,000 years ahead of its time, coming out of the ground bright and unrusted. It says that 8,000 faces were carved from life by a single genius, and that every one of them is a portrait, and that nobody knows how any of it was done. Tonight we are going to set all of that down. Softly, the way you take off a heavy coat in a warm room, without any triumph about it, and without any argument. I am not going to spend the night telling you that you were fooled. Because you were not fooled, you were only told a story by people who liked it, which is how most of us learn most things. And I am not going to spend the night sneering at the loud version either, because parts of the loud version turn out rather wonderfully to be true, and we will come to those in their own time, and I would like you to be able to enjoy them when we do. But the true story is slower than the loud one. It is quieter. It has a great deal more paperwork in it and considerably fewer whips. And it is much more human, and it is a far better thing to fall asleep to. It is a story about a very large number of ordinary men who did a very difficult job for a very long time. In shifts, in the cold, badly fed, a long way from home, and who left their names behind almost by accident, because a suspicious government made them do it. There is no massacre at the end of it. There is only attrition and weather and 40 years, and then 2,000 more years of nothing happening at all, which as sleep material goes is close to perfect. But before we can arrive at any of that, we have to go back one layer further than the subject itself, because that is the only honest way to begin anything. Before there was a terracotta army, there was not even a China. There was no such country. There was no such word for it in the sense that we mean. There was a wide, cold, dusty, river-cut stretch of the world. And scattered across it there were kingdoms, and the kingdoms had been fighting one another for so long that fighting one another had stopped being an event and had quietly become a climate. Historians call it the Warring States period, which is one of those names that sounds like a title and is really only a description. It runs roughly for 2.5 centuries. 7 kingdoms remained by the end of it, having slowly eaten all the others. Qin in the west, tough and dry and looked down upon. Chu in the vast wet south, huge and green and slow. Qi on the eastern coast, rich with salt and fish and conversation. Yan in the cold northeast, and Han, Zhao and Wei in the middle, wedged shoulder to shoulder on the crowded plain like 3 people sharing 2 chairs. They had been at this for generations. A man could be born, grow old and die inside one long argument between 2 of them, and never once live through a year that anybody would have called peace. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing suddenly real, and it is not a battle. Each of those 7 kingdoms wrote in its own script, so that the same word looked like a different word depending on which side of a river it was written on. Each minted its own coin, and the coins were not even the same shape. Some were round, some were shaped like little bronze knives, some like little bronze spades, so that a merchant crossing a border carried a purse of small metal tools that had stopped being tools and had not quite finished becoming money. Each measured grain in its own baskets and weighed silk against its own stones, and each built its carts to its own axle width. Sit with that last one for a moment, because it is my favourite. Roads in that world were not paved surfaces. Roads were ruts. Loess is a fine, pale, wind-blown soil, deep and soft and easily cut, and generations of cartwheels wear grooves down into it that are very nearly as good as rails, and a cart runs sweetly in those grooves and appallingly out of them. So if your kingdom's axles were a hand's breadth wider than your neighbour's, your cart physically could not run on your neighbour's road. Not would not. Could not. It would ride up out of the ruts and lurch and shed its load, and you would stand in the dust in a foreign country at dusk with a broken axle and a very great deal of time to think about politics. The kingdoms were not merely at war with one another. They did not fit one another. Picture that world for a while, since we have the whole night for it. Picture cold river fog lying in the valleys before dawn, thick enough that the tops of the mulberry trees float in it like something drawn on paper. Picture a walled town of rammed earth, the walls made by pounding damp loess between wooden shutters, layer upon layer upon layer, until it sets as hard as poor concrete. And picture how a wall like that holds the night's chill inside it until nearly noon. Picture millet fields going yellow, and the smell of millet steaming, which is the smell of ordinary life across that entire world for 1,000 years. Picture bronze the colour of a new coin, not the green we know, because green is what happens later to things we were not meant to see. Picture a farmer whose entire horizon is 4 days wide. Picture nobody, anywhere, having any reason at all to imagine that all of this would ever be one thing. Now into that patient, muddy, endless quarrel walks the state of Qin, and Qin is going to become the reason for everything that follows, so we should look at it properly and slowly. Qin sat in the west, up the Wei River Valley, with the mountains at its back and the passes at its throat. The other kingdoms considered it half barbarian, which is the sort of thing prosperous places tend to say about poor places, right up until the poor place arrives at the gate. Qin had less silk and less poetry and less talk than the East. What Qin developed instead, quite deliberately, over a long time, was administration. Around 356 years before the Common Era, a man named Shang Yang began a set of reforms in Qin that would remake it from the inside out, and those reforms are the true foundation of every single thing we are going to speak about tonight. Not the emperor. Not the army. This, Shang Yang's idea, was simple and cold and in its way revolutionary, that law should stand above birth, that a man's family should not decide his rank. That rank should be earned by service to the state, measured, recorded and granted according to a published schedule, so that a farmer's son who did what the state wanted might rise, and a nobleman's son who did not might fall. And that both of these things should be written down where anyone could check them. So Qin wrote things down. Qin wrote everything down. It registered its households. It gathered them into little mutually responsible bundles of families, so that neighbours were legally answerable for one another, which is an extraordinarily effective way to run a country, and an extraordinarily unpleasant way to live in one. It standardised whatever it could reach. It fixed punishments to offences in a public schedule, so that everybody knew the price of everything well in advance. It counted its grain, and its men, and its carts, and its years. It rewarded two things only, farming and fighting, and it quietly starved everything that was neither. And slowly, across about a century, Qin stopped being a kingdom in the ordinary sense, and became something else, a very large, very patient piece of administrative machinery, with a king sitting on top of it more or less as a component. It was a state that wrote everything down, which is a habit that tends to age badly for tyrants, and remarkably well for archaeologists. We will come back to that more than once. In fact, nearly everything tender in tonight's story exists only because a cold government kept its receipts. And Shangyang himself, since you may be wondering, was eventually pulled apart by his own machine, on a charge drawn from his own law code, having been unable to find shelter for a night on the road because he had personally made it illegal to lodge a traveller without papers. I mention this not to be cruel, and not as a triumph, but because it is the neatest small parable in the entire period, and because it tells you precisely what sort of engine Qin had become. Once it was running, it did not much care who had built it. That is the machine, then, it is worth saying plainly before we leave it, that none of this was built in order to make a wonder of the world. Nobody in Qin was thinking about wonders. They were thinking about grain yields and troop counts, and whether the man who made the faulty spearhead could be found by Thursday. Everything astonishing that happens in tonight's story happens as a byproduct of a government trying to keep track of things. Which is, in fairness, how a surprising amount of astonishment gets made. So that is the political ground under tonight's story, but there is another ground under it, older and slower and rather more important than politics. And if you understand this part, you will understand what the Terracotta Army actually is. So let us go down one more layer, gently, and talk about what the dead used to be given. For a very long time in that part of the world, as in a good many other parts of the world, a great person did not go into the earth alone. Rank was not a thing you left behind at the graveside. A ruler had been served in life, and it was understood, in the plain, unquestioned way that terrible things are always understood, that he would want serving afterwards. So he was given servants. Not statues of servants. Servants, this is the practice we politely call human sacrifice, and in the Shang period and for some time after it, it was not a rumour or an exaggeration or a slander invented by a later dynasty. It is in the ground. It has been dug up. It has been counted. The most useful example for tonight sits inside Qin itself. The tomb of Duke Jing of Qin, opened in the modern era after 10 years of excavation, is an enormous cross-shaped pit, and it held well over 100 sacrificed people, laid in around their lord, some of them in coffins, arranged with a kind of care that somehow makes it worse rather than better, and a good many others simply placed, without coffins, without ceremony, in the fill of the pit. Attendants, grooms, musicians probably, people whose names were not thought worth a mark, because the point of them was never who they were. The point of them was that the Duke should not be inconvenienced. And then, across the centuries, something changes. It does not change because of a hero. Nobody rides in and abolishes it in one glorious afternoon. It changes the way real things change, which is slowly, unevenly, for mixed and often unlovely reasons, with people arguing about it the entire time, and mostly arguing about cost. What happens is substitution. The idea gradually takes hold that what the dead require is not the thing itself, but a convincing likeness of the thing. That a model will serve. That the shape is what matters. There is a word for these objects. Mingqi. Spirit goods. Vessels made for the dead rather than borrowed from the living. Little bronze pots too thin ever to cook in. Little houses with little courtyards and little pigs in the little pens. Granaries the size of a loaf, full of nothing at all. Wells with tiny buckets on tiny ropes. Stoves with tiny pots standing on them, and in place of the servants, figures. First, in the oldest and cheapest form, bundles of straw tied roughly into the shape of a person, which is about as far from a human being as an object can get, while still being recognised as standing in for one. Then wood, carved and painted, sometimes with arms that move, and faces of a sort. Then clay. It is a strange, touching, faintly absurd body of objects, and I recommend it to you as a thing to think about drowsily. Somebody sat down and made a granary that could never hold grain, with a little ladder leaning against it, and got the ladder right. Somebody made a well and gave it a rope. Somebody made a pigsty and put a pig in it, and gave the pig an expression. These were not toys, and nobody played with them. They were sincerity, expressed in miniature, on a budget, by craftsmen who were solving a metaphysical problem with their hands because nobody else was going to. And every one of them says the same quiet thing, which is that the thing itself is no longer required, only the likeness of it, only the shape. Follow that line, and you can watch an entire civilization slowly talk itself out of something monstrous. One grade at a time. Straw, then wood, then clay. Each step is a small argument, won quietly, that the dead can be satisfied with less. It took centuries. There were relapses, and there were places that never entirely stopped, and I am not going to hand you a clean story in which a bad thing simply ends on a particular Tuesday, because that is not how anything ends. But the direction is clear enough, and it is one of the very few directions in ancient history that anybody should feel good about. There was even a philosophical quarrel about it, because there is always a philosophical quarrel about everything. Some thinkers of that age disliked the substitutes precisely because they were so lifelike. Their worry was that a figure convincing enough to stand in for a person tonight is a figure that keeps the idea of using a person warm for tomorrow, that the likeness preserves the habit. It is a serious objection, and I will simply leave it with you as a thing to turn over slowly while you drift off, and you do not have to solve it. It has not been solved yet by anybody else either. Because here is what all of that means, and it is the second best idea in tonight's episode, so I will say it slowly and only once, and then let it lie there. The Terracotta Army is not the beginning of something. Everybody tells it as a beginning, the strange new marvel, the unprecedented wonder, the thing that came out of nowhere. It did not come out of nowhere. It is the end of something. It is the last and largest word in an argument that had been running for centuries about whether the dead need real servants or merely convincing ones, and the answer, delivered at enormous expense in fired clay, is that convincing ones will do. 8,000 men in the ground, and every single one of them is a man who was not put in the ground. That is what those figures are. They are the largest substitution in the history of the world. They are, and I mean this exactly, mercy at scale, and mercy at scale does not look like mercy, because it looks like an industry. And it was one. Nobody in that shed was feeling merciful. Gong Chang was not feeling merciful. He was feeling cold, and slightly behind schedule. But the whole enormous cold machine of it stands where 100 open graves would once have stood, and that is worth knowing before we go any further, because it changes what you are looking at when you look at those ranks. So we have our ground now. We have 7 kingdoms that do not fit one another, grinding along in the fog. We have one of them out in the west, quietly turning itself into a filing system with an army attached. And we have a very old idea, gradually softening, that the dead should be given a whole world. All 3 of those things are in place. None of them are in any hurry. None of them know about each other. And they are about to be brought together by an accident of birth, in a city that belonged to somebody else, 259 years before the Common Era. The city is Handan, the capital of Zhao, one of the 3 kingdoms of the crowded Middle Plain, and Zhao and Qin are enemies in the ordinary way that everybody is everybody's enemy in that century. Living in Handan is a prince of Qin, and he is living there because he is a hostage. This was normal. Kingdoms exchanged princes as security the way we exchange signatures, and a hostage prince was a comfortable, humiliated, slightly ornamental man with no particular future, kept in a decent house in a foreign capital, and watched. He is not an important prince. He is one of many sons of a middling line, and his own father has a great many sons, and the odds of this one ever sitting on any throne anywhere are approximately the odds of a particular grain of millet being noticed in a particular bowl. He is a man whose entire career is expected to consist of remaining alive in somebody else's city. There is a merchant in Handan, a wealthy one, who looks at this useless prince and sees something that nobody else sees, and does the arithmetic, and decides to invest. But that is tomorrow's business, and not tonight's. In that year, in that house, in that foreign city, a child is born to that hostage prince. He is named Zheng, Ying Zheng, of the house of Qin. There is no omen recorded. There is no comet, no dream, no sage arriving at the gate with a prophecy, because those are the sort of things that get written into a life afterwards, once it is worth decorating, and at this particular moment there is nothing whatever to decorate. Nobody writes anything down about the birth. It is not that the record is lost, it is that there is no record, because there was no reason on earth to make one. A baby is born to a nobody, in a city under guard, in the cold, in the middle of a war, that has been going on for 200 years and is expected to go on for 200 more. He will unify 7 kingdoms. He will make the script one script, and the coin one coin, and the axle one width, so that every cart in the world can run in every rut in the world. He will take a title that does not exist yet, because no existing word will be large enough for what he intends to be. He will send men out over the sea to look for a drug that will stop him from dying. He will swallow the metal that is killing him. He will die anyway, on a road a long way from home, aged 49, and be carried back to his capital behind carts of salted fish, and he will spend 38 years, which is to say every single year of his reign from the first to the last, building a room that he did not believe he would ever need, and it will still be unfinished when they put him into it. But tonight he is a few hours old, in Handan, in a house that is not his family's, in a kingdom that is not his, and he weighs almost nothing. And he can do almost nothing, and his name means nothing at all to anybody outside that room. Let him be that for a while. It is nicer. And a long way to the west of him, up the Wei Valley, in the country he has never seen and will one day rule, there is a hill. It is a low, ordinary, pleasant hill, with pomegranate and persimmon growing on its skirts and hot springs coming up warm out of the ground at its foot, and it is called Mount Lee. There is nothing on it. There is nothing under it. It is grass and stone and loess and rain, and the fog comes off the river in the mornings and settles into its folds, and farmers work its lower fields and think nothing whatever about it, any more than you think about the hill nearest your own house. It has 13 years left of being an ordinary hill. 13 years until a boy who has only just been born, in a city that is not his, gives an order, or has an order given in his name, and the first spade goes into that soil. 13 quiet years of nothing at all. Grass and rain and fog in the folds, and the hot springs steaming faintly on cold mornings, and the whole hill standing there empty and patient and entirely unaware, the way that hills do, which is the only way they know how. The child born at Handan in 259 before the Common Era grows up the way almost every child grows up, which is to say slowly and quietly, and almost entirely out of sight of the people who will later write about him. We know very little about the boy called Zheng. We know that his father was a hostage prince, parked in an enemy capital as a kind of living promissory note between 2 kingdoms that did not trust each other and had no intention of starting. We know that his mother's history was later rewritten several times by men with reasons. We know that a wealthy merchant named Lu Bue attached himself to the family the way a careful investor attaches himself to a badly undervalued asset, and that the investment eventually paid out in a way that no merchant in the world had ever been paid out before. Beyond that, the boy's childhood is a smooth grey stone. There are no anecdotes we can trust. There are no charming stories about what he was like at 7. There is only the fact of him, moving forward through the years, growing taller, learning to read a script that he would one day abolish and replace with a tidier one. And then, in 246 before the Common Era, when he is 13 years old, his father dies, and the boy becomes king of Qin. 13. Hold that number gently for a moment, because everything tonight hangs from it. He is 13 years old, and he is now the sovereign of the most efficient, most frightening, most thoroughly organized state in the known world. A state that has spent 100 years turning itself into a machine for producing soldiers and grain and paperwork in roughly equal quantities. He does not rule it, of course. A 13-year-old does not rule anything except perhaps his own bedroom, and often not that. The state is run for him by Lu Bue, the merchant, now chancellor and regent, which means that for the better part of a decade, the most dangerous kingdom in China is administered by a man who came up in the trade of buying low and selling high. There is something almost restful about that, if you let yourself think about it in the right light. The great legalist war machine of Qin, the terror of the Eastern kingdoms, being kept in good order for several years by an accountant with excellent instincts. And in that same year, 246 before the Common Era in the same season. In the same round of decisions that a new reign always brings, something else begins. About 30 kilometers east of the capital, at the foot of a wooded limestone hill called Mount Lee, men begin to dig. This is the fact that the rest of the night rests on, so let us say it slowly, and let us say it more than once, because it is the sort of fact that improves with repetition. The tomb begins the year he takes the throne, not at the end of his life, not when he grew old or ill or afraid. At 13. Before the empire existed, before there was any such thing as a first emperor, before there was any such thing as a unified China, before he had conquered a single kingdom or standardized a single measuring cup, the digging had already started at Mount Lee. The room was begun before the man had done anything to deserve it, and it would go on being dug and shaped and enlarged and replanned for about 38 years, which is to say for the entire length of his reign, from the day he was crowned to the day he died and was carried into it. And even then, after 38 years, it would not be finished. He spent his whole life building the room he did not believe he would ever need. That is worth sitting with for a while, because it is an extraordinarily human contradiction, and it is not a contradiction that belongs only to him. He was, we are told, terrified of dying. He would spend a fortune on the search for a way not to. He would send ships east over the sea, looking for islands of immortals. He would swallow things that no person should swallow, on the advice of men who assured him they had read about it somewhere. And the entire time, for 38 patient years, thousands of people were digging him a grave. He never called it off. He never told them to stop, because he was working on a permanent alternative. He simply let both projects run, side by side, year after year, the immortality and the tomb, the hope and the hedge, which is either the deepest kind of wisdom or the deepest kind of denial, and honestly it may not be possible to tell those two apart from the outside. It is an ambitious plan for a boy who has not yet learned to shave. For most of the first 8 years, the young king is a spectator at his own reign. He watches. He learns the shape of the court, the way a child learns the shape of a house in the dark, by walking into things. Lu Bue governs. The armies move on the eastern frontier the way they have moved for a century, gaining a county here, a river crossing there, grinding, patient, unglamorous. And the boy grows. And then, in 238 before the Common Era, when he is 21 years old, the court finally does something interesting enough to be recorded, and it is a mess. There was a man at court named Lao Ai, a favourite of the Queen Dowager, elevated far beyond anything his abilities justified, given lands and household and titles, and eventually given enough rope to arrange his own hanging. In 238, Lao Ai raised a revolt. It failed, quickly and completely, in the way that revolts by favourites usually fail, because a favourite has followers rather than soldiers, and the two are not the same thing when it reigns. The consequences were severe and are described in the sources with the flat, unhurried cruelty that Qin records tend to have. Lao Ai was executed. His faction was destroyed. His household was wiped out. The Queen Dowager was removed from the capital, and Lu Bue, the merchant, the regent, the man who had run the country for 8 years and made the whole arrangement possible in the first place, was implicated, stripped of office, sent away to a distant estate, and then, understanding perfectly well what the next letter from the capital was going to say, took his own life before it arrived. And on the other side of all that, standing in a court that had just been thoroughly emptied of everyone who had ever told him what to do, was a young man of 21 who now ruled Qin in fact, as well as in name. We should be careful here, because this is exactly the moment where a louder version of this story would reach for the music. It would give him a hard look. It would say that the boy became a monster on that day. But the honest answer is that we do not know what he felt about any of it. We do not know whether he grieved for Lu Bue, or was relieved, or was simply busy. What we can see from the outside at a distance of 22 centuries is a change in tempo. From 238 onward, the machine starts running faster. Into the space where the regent had been came a man named Li Si, and Li Si is, in a quiet way, the most consequential person in this entire episode who never touched a lump of clay. He was a scholar from the state of Chu, a student of legalist philosophy and administrator of frightening clarity, and he believed in a very simple idea that has echoed uncomfortably down every century since, that a state should be organized as a system of rules and consequences, uniformly applied, with no exceptions for birth, no exceptions for virtue, no exceptions for anybody. Reward the useful, punish the useless, write it all down, apply it to everybody, including yourself, and especially including your friends. It is a philosophy with a certain terrible cleanliness to it. It removes the need to think about people as people, which is enormously efficient, right up until the moment it is not. Under Li Si, the ideas that Shang Yang had planted in the Qin soil more than a century earlier came fully into flower. Everything was registered. Everything was countable. Households were grouped, and the groups were made responsible for each other's conduct, so that surveillance was not a thing the state had to do, but a thing the neighbours had to do. Officials were held liable for the work of the people beneath them. Craftsmen were held liable for the objects they made. Remember that last one. We will come back to it, and when we do it will turn out to be the whole reason we know anything at all about the men in the clay sheds. Then came the wars, and here I am going to ask you to let the wars stay soft. This is not the place for battles. The Eastern Kingdoms fell one after another between 230 and 221 before the Common Era, and each of those falls involved enormous suffering, sieges, drownings, famine, and the ordinary catastrophic arithmetic of ancient warfare. And none of that is going to help you sleep, so we will do it the way a map does it. Picture a map, very large, drawn on silk, laid flat on a table in a quiet room. 7 kingdoms in 7 colours. And one of the colours begins, very slowly, to spread. Han falls first in 230. It was the smallest and the nearest, and it had been shrinking for a long time already, the way a country shrinks when it is standing in the wrong place on the map. Zhao falls in 228. This was the hard one. The kingdom of Zheng's own childhood. The place where he was born, defended by good generals for years, undone in the end by famine and earthquake, and a court that could not stop arguing with itself. Wei falls in 225. Its capital was taken by diverting a river into the city walls and letting the water do the work, which is a very Qin solution, patient, engineered, indifferent and effective. Chu, the great sprawling southern kingdom of rice and marshes and poets, falls in 223, and it took the largest army Qin had ever put in the field, and it took 2 attempts. And Chu never entirely forgave it, and we will meet the men of Chu again later tonight in a way you will not expect and will not enjoy. Yan falls in 222, in the far north, up where the winters are serious. And Qi, in the east, on the seacoast, rich and old and comfortable, falls last in 221, and Qi barely fought at all. Qi simply looked at the map, saw that every colour was now one colour except its own, and stopped. And so the map is finished. One colour. For the first time in the history of the world, the thing we now call China exists as a single administered space, and it took 9 years, and it happened because a state spent a century and a half learning to count things properly. There is a temptation to say this was inevitable. It was not. There is a temptation to say it was glorious. Ask the people of Chu. What is true is that it was thorough. 221 before the Common Era. He is 38 years old. He rules everything he has ever heard of. And he sits down with his ministers to solve a genuinely novel problem, which is that there is no word for what he now is. King is not enough. Every one of the men he has just eliminated was a king. King is a word that means one of several, and there are no longer several. So they reached back into the deep well of legend. into the old half-divine names of the sage rulers of the mythical past, the ones spoken of in the way we speak of gods and grandfathers at the same time, and they took two of those words, Huang and Di, August and divine, and they welded them together into a title no living person had ever borne, and he put Shi in front of it, meaning first. Shi Huangdi, first August Emperor, and the plan, stated openly, was that his son would be the second emperor, and his grandson the third, and so on down to the 10,000th generation, which is a wonderfully specific way of saying forever. The empire lasted about 15 years. But we are not there yet, and we are not going to hurry toward it. Now comes my favourite part of the reign, and it is not a battle, and it is not a massacre, and it is not a magic sword. It is stationary. Because having conquered everything, he then did something far stranger and far more permanent than conquering. He made everything match. The scripts of the Seven Kingdoms had drifted apart over 2.5 centuries, until a document written in Qi could not be comfortably read in Qin. So the script was standardized on Li Si's authority into a single official form, and the variants were suppressed, and from then on a clerk in the far south could read an order written in the north, which sounds like a small administrative convenience, and was in fact one of the most consequential decisions anyone has ever made. Because it is a large part of the reason there is still a China today, rather than a Europe. The coinage was standardized, from the knives and spades and shells and korais and odd little bronze objects of 7 separate monetary traditions into one round coin with one square hole, which is the shape you still see in every antique shop in the world. Weights and measures were standardized, and the standards were cast in bronze, and copies were sent out to every county, and the edict was inscribed directly on the weights themselves, so that the object carried the law that made it legal. And then, having standardized the words and the money and the volumes and the masses, he standardized the axles. This is the detail I want to leave with you, because it explains the man better than any story about tyranny. The roads of ancient China were not paved. They were loess, deep and soft and yellow, and every cart that used a road cut ruts into it, and after a few hundred years of traffic those ruts were deep enough to steer a cart by themselves. The cart did not so much drive on the road as ride in it, which meant that the width between a cart's wheels, the axle width, was effectively a national gauge, like a railway, and the 7 kingdoms had 7 gauges. A merchant from Yan could load his cart, drive it to the old border of Zhao, and there, in a perfectly ordinary field on a perfectly ordinary afternoon, discover that his wheels did not fit the grooves of the ground in front of him. So the empire fixed the axle width. 1 gauge everywhere by law, and now every cart in the world fits every road in the world. Sit with the mind that does that. It is not primarily a cruel mind. It is not even primarily an ambitious mind. It is a mind that cannot bear things that do not match. It looks out over a continent of local variation, of charming regional difference, of the accumulated crooked beauty of centuries of people doing things their own way, and it does not feel wonder. It feels an itch, and it does not rest until the itch is gone. Remember that, please, when we walk into the clay sheds next and find 8,000 men made of interchangeable parts, from shared moulds, in matched batches, each one stamped with the name of the person responsible for it. A man who standardizes the distance between the wheels of every cart on earth is exactly the man who will want his soldiers made to a specification, and will want to know precisely which workshop to blame when one of them comes out wrong. The army is not a work of art commissioned by an aesthete. It is a very large procurement contract, issued by the most exacting customer who has ever lived. That is the bridge we are walking across tonight, and we will reach the other side of it soon enough. Meanwhile, the emperor could not sit still. He toured, 5 great tours in 11 years, out to the east, to the coast, up the sacred mountains, along the new roads, with an enormous retinue and a schedule, stopping to erect stone tablets inscribed with descriptions of his own excellence, which is one of the few genuinely funny things about him, and which archaeologists are extremely grateful for. He climbed Mount Tai and performed sacrifices there. He stood on the shore of the Eastern Sea, which he had never seen before he was nearly 40, and looked out at it. And it was somewhere out on those roads, on those long swaying journeys, that the thing began to grow in him that would eventually eat him. He began to think seriously about not dying. We will not develop that tonight. It belongs to a later hour. But it starts here, on the road, in his 40s, in the specific way that it starts for many people, which is that he had finished everything he set out to do and had a great deal of time to sit in a moving carriage and think about the fact that it would all continue perfectly well without him. Meanwhile, the empire was being rebuilt physically, all at once, everywhere. In the north, the General Meng Tian took an army of 300,000 and pushed the frontier out into the steppe, and then joined and rebuilt and extended the old defensive walls of the northern kingdoms into one long earthen line, the ancestor of the wall the world visits today, which is not the same wall and was not made of the same stuff and does not stand in the same places, but which came from the same instinct. Roads were driven straight across the country, and one of them, the direct road, ran nearly 800 kilometres north from the capital region and was built to allow an army to move fast, and parts of its embankment are still visible from the air. Canals were cut, including one in the far south that joined two river systems and let grain barges reach an army that was fighting in a jungle. And at Xianyang, the capital, he began the Apang Palace, a building complex of such reported size that the descriptions have never been entirely believed, and its front hall was said to seat 10,000 people, and it was never finished either, and the archaeology suggests the platform was raised and the palace above it may never have gone up at all. I want you to hold all of those in your mind at once, softly, not as a list of achievements, but as a competition. The wall, the roads, the canals, the palace, the tomb. Every one of those projects needed the same thing, not money, particularly. Bodies, all of them were drawing from the same pool of human beings, the same registered, counted, organised population, the same young men from the same villages, called up in rotation, sent to the north or the south or the west. To dig or carry or ram earth for a season or a year or 3 years or, sometimes, forever, Mount Li was not the emperor's only project. It was one of several vast projects competing for the same tired shoulders, and that competition is the reason the tomb was never finished, and the reason the empire fell, and those are the same reason. It is worth saying plainly, and without any heat, that the pool was finite. A registered population can be counted, and a counted population can be allocated, and an allocated population can be over-allocated by a man who is very good at arithmetic, and not especially interested in fatigue. The records that survive from the Qin are full of schedules, quotas, rations and penalties for lateness, and they are not the records of a state that hated its subjects. They are the records of a state that had stopped being able to see them, because it had learned to see numbers instead, and numbers do not get tired, and numbers do not have mothers. And numbers can be moved from one column to another at the end of a long day by a clerk who is himself extremely tired and would like to go home. That is the quiet machinery underneath everything we are about to look at. Nobody in this story is twirling a moustache. Everybody in this story is meeting a target. Now let us walk out to the hill. Mount Li sits east of Xianyang, a limestone ridge with hot springs at its foot, wooded, unremarkable, pleasant. The old sources say it was chosen because of the beauty of the place, because of jade on the northern side and gold on the southern, which may be geology or may be poetry. The likelier truth is duller and better. It was the right distance from the capital. The loess was deep and workable, and the drainage was good. Whatever the reason, from 246 onward, the hill began to change. A mound was raised over the chamber, built of rammed earth, layer by layer, each layer wetted and beaten flat by teams with wooden rammers before the next was laid on. Which is how you build a mountain that will still be there in 2,000 years. And around that mound over the decades, something grew that was not a grave. Try to stop using the word tomb for a moment, because it is the wrong shape. What was laid out around Mount Lee was a city, not a metaphor. A city, planned as cities were planned, with an inner wall and an outer wall enclosing the sacred ground with gates and towers at the corners and roads between them. There were buildings for the officials who would administer the emperor's afterlife. There were stables with real horses in them, buried in rows, each with its groom. There were storehouses. There were offices. There was a whole park of subsidiary pits and halls and courtyards spreading out from the mound in every direction, and the archaeology of the last 50 years keeps finding more of them. And the total area now understood to belong to the necropolis is roughly 56 square kilometres. 56 square kilometres. That is not a burial. That is a district. And to run it, they founded a town. It was called Lee, and it was built near the works, and it was populated deliberately, with families moved in to live there, and its entire purpose was to service the necropolis, which meant to feed the workers, to house the officials, to keep the offerings coming, to maintain the halls, to burn the incense, to sweep the roads, forever on a permanent basis, with a budget. He was not building himself a place to be dead. He was building himself an administration to be dead inside. The man could not conceive of an eternity that did not have a staff and a filing system, and you have to admire the follow-through in a way. Most people who fear death comfort themselves with vague ideas. This one commissioned a ministry. So the hill filled up. Not quickly. Nothing about this happened quickly. Season after season, year after year, the mound rose a little, the walls extended a little, the pits multiplied a little, and men came and worked and left and were replaced. And the whole enormous slow machine ground forward, funded, scheduled, inspected, and written down in triplicate. While out in the world the kingdoms fell and the script changed, and the coins changed, and the axles changed. And the boy became a king, and the king became an emperor, and the emperor began, very quietly, to get older. And then, at some point that no document records, in a year we cannot name, surveyors walked out about 1.5 kilometres east of the mound, into flat farming ground, and began to mark. They set out a rectangle, very large, its long sides running east and west, and then more rectangles beside it, and then a small one, and then another that would never be used. Nobody wrote down why they chose east. There are guesses. East was the direction of the conquered kingdoms, the direction the threat had always come from, the direction from which any ghost with a grievance would arrive, and there were a great many ghosts out east with grievances. East is where the sun comes up. East is where the sea was, and the islands of the immortals and the ships he kept sending out. Any of those might be right. All of them might be. None of them is written anywhere, and that absence is the first hint of tonight's strangest fact, which is that almost nothing about this project was written down at all. And then the earth was opened, the topsoil came off, and under it the loess, that fine yellow wind-blown dust that has been settling on this part of the world for hundreds of thousands of years, dry and soft and easy to cut, and quite happy to hold a vertical wall. They dug down about 5 meters. They left ramps at the ends. They left long parallel walls of rammed earth standing between the trenches, like the aisles of a barn, to hold up the roof that was coming. They laid a floor of grey brick, hundreds of thousands of bricks, each one fired and carried and set by hand. And then they stopped, and stood back and looked at what they had made, and what they had made was nothing at all. Empty corridors in the ground. Long, straight, clean, quiet, and completely empty. Picture it at the end of the day. The sun going down behind the mound to the west, so that the mound throws a long shadow across the trenches. The lowest walls holding the last of the light, gone the colour of honey, the way Lois always goes at dusk. The brick floors cooling. A few tools left where they were dropped. Somebody walking the length of it with a tally, counting, no soldiers. No clay, no paint. Not yet, just a set of enormous, patient, beautifully made holes in a field, waiting for something that had not been built yet, in a country that had only just been invented, for a man who was not going to die for a very long time, or so he had every intention of arranging. And behind them, to the west, the mound sitting quiet in the dusk, growing by a few handbreadths a year, and the lamps coming on in the little town of Lii, and 30 kilometres further on, the capital, where a middle-aged man who had made every cart on earth the same width was sitting up late with a stack of documents, weighing them, because he had given orders that he would not sleep until he had read his fixed weight of paperwork for the day. He weighed his workload. Of course he did. Tomorrow the clay. So the trenches lie open in the loess east of the mound, long and parallel and quiet, and now we must turn away from them for a while, because nothing is going to happen in those trenches for a very long time. The interesting work is happening somewhere else. It is happening in sheds. If you want to understand the Terracotta Army, you have to stop looking at the army and start looking at the sheds, at the low grey buildings scattered across the foot of Mount Lee where the clay was worked, and at the kilns breathing their slow smoke into a cold morning, and at the water and the treading and the hands. Let us go there together, very slowly, and let us not be in any hurry at all. The clay came from the ground beneath their feet. This is worth pausing on, because it is one of those small facts that quietly rearranges everything else. They did not import some fine and famous material from a distant province. They dug up the hill. The whole region around Mount Lee sits under a deep blanket of loess, a wind-blown silt carried in over tens of thousands of years from the deserts and the dry lands to the north and west, laid down grain by grain, so fine that it will hold a vertical wall and so soft that a man with a wooden spade can open a room in it in an afternoon. It is pale and yellowish and slightly gritty between the fingers, and it smells faintly of dust and rain even when it is wet. The workmen dug it out in pits, and they cleaned it, picking out the stones and the roots and the little chalky nodules that would burst in a kiln and take the leg off a soldier, and then they mixed it with sand, with quartz grains, a temper to open the body of the clay and let it dry evenly and survive the fire. Then they added water, and then they trod it, barefoot most likely or in straw sandals, in a shallow pit, walking in a slow circle for a long time, turning the mass under their heels until the sand and the silt and the water became one single obedient substance, with no lumps and no dry seams and no trapped air. It is dull, patient, ankle-deep work, and it is the beginning of everything. 2,200 years later, a person can stand in a museum in Shanxi and look at a soldier's calm face and never once think about the fact that somebody stood in a cold pit at dawn and walked in circles in the mud until the clay was right. But somebody did. Every single time. Imagine the sound of the sheds in the morning. Straw smoke, low and blue, hanging in the air because there is no wind yet. The knock of wooden mallets. The wet slap of a coil of clay laid onto the rim of a torso and pressed down. Somebody scraping a board clean. Somebody carrying water. The kilns are already lit, a long way off, and they will burn all day and all night and be raked out in the grey hours before dawn. The air smells of river silt and of straw and of ash, and later in the day it will smell of lacquer, which is a smell that nobody who has ever worked with it forgets. There is millet steaming somewhere for the midday ration. It is not a romantic place. It is a large, cold, damp, well-organised industrial site under a hill, and it is going to be running, in one form or another, for most of 40 years. Now, the method. I am going to explain to you how a terracotta warrior was actually made in some detail, and I would like to promise you in advance that this is not going to get exciting. This is a craft documentary told at half speed by a person who would very much like you to be asleep before the firing. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of the torsos, you have my blessing, and you will not have missed anything except how the arms went on. They began at the bottom, and they began solid. The feet and the lower legs of a terracotta warrior are not hollow. They are heavy, dense masses of fired clay, and they exist because a figure of that size, standing upright for what its makers imagined would be forever, needs ballast. Under the feet in most cases sits a square clay plinth, a flat slab that spreads the weight and stops the whole man from sinking slowly into the floor of the pit over the centuries. So the first thing a soldier ever was a pair of very solid boots on a tile. From the thighs upward the body opens out and becomes hollow, and this is where the potters take over from the labourers, because a hollow torso the size of a man's chest is a serious piece of ceramic work. They built it up in coils, a long rope of clay laid round, pressed down, joined, smoothed inside and out, and then another laid on top of it, and then another, the wall rising a hand's breadth at a time, the shape of the body coming out of the potter's memory rather than out of any mould. The torso had to be thick enough to survive its own weight and thin enough to survive the fire, and it had to dry slowly under damp cloths and straw, because clay that dries quickly cracks, and a cracked man is a fined foreman, which is a detail we will be coming back to a little later tonight. The arms were made separately, in their own place, by their own hands. The forearms and the hands separately again, the fingers worked with a wooden tool, and the palms very often left loosely curled, because they were not meant to be empty. Something was going to be put into that grip. The heads were made in moulds, 2 halves, front and back, pressed with clay, joined at the seam, and then, crucially, taken away and worked over by hand for a long time by somebody who knew what a face was. The ears were often made separately and added on. Then the parts were brought together and luted, which is the word for it, and it means joined with slip, a wet slurry of the same clay painted along the join and pressed home while everything was leather hard, that lovely stage where the clay has gone firm enough to hold its own shape and stays wet enough to accept a marriage. A head went down into the collar of a torso on a short cylindrical neck and could still be turned a little and adjusted and considered before the join was set. The whole standing figure then went into the kiln, or rather the kiln was built up around it in stages, and it was fired at somewhere around 1000 degrees, for days, and it came out ringing and hard and pale, and rather more durable than the empire that made it. Now I would like to take away a picture that you almost certainly have in your head, because it is a false one, and taking it away will make the rest of tonight much kinder. The picture is of an assembly line. A great shed, a moving belt, 1,000 identical men in rows, each performing one action forever, stamping out one soldier after another, faceless workers making faceless warriors, the whole thing a sort of ancient factory of despair. It is a very cinematic image. It is also, as far as anyone can tell from the objects themselves, wrong. What the evidence describes is something quieter and, I think, much stranger. The technical name for the pattern is cellular production and sometimes small batch production, and what it means is this: the work was not divided by task, it was divided by team. There was no line, there were cells. Small groups of craftsmen, each group under its own foreman, each group working in parallel with all the other groups, and each group building complete figures from beginning to end out of a shared kit of standard parts. One team made whole soldiers, the team next door made whole soldiers, the team beyond them made whole soldiers. They all drew on the same repertoire of legs and torsos and heads and arms, the way a modern workshop might use a standard range of sizes, and then each team finished its own figures in its own way, with its own habits, its own thumbprints, its own small opinions about how an eyebrow ought to sit. The same pattern turns up in the bronze weapons, which is the part that convinced people, because bronze is easier to be precise about than clay. When you look at the crossbow triggers, those small interchangeable mechanisms of several parts each, the variation does not spread smoothly across the whole assemblage the way it would if one enormous centralized operation were producing them in a single stream. It clumps. Batches of triggers resemble one another closely and differ from the next batch. Arrowheads come in bundles, roughly in hundreds, and the arrowheads within a bundle are near twins while the bundles differ from each other. That is the fingerprint of many small parallel workshops, each turning out complete objects to a common specification and delivering them in lots. So the true picture is not one factory. It is closer to 80 small potteries working at the same time on the same hillside to the same standard. Modular, yes. Mechanical, no. Which is a much better thing to fall asleep to, because it means that at any given moment across those 40 years, the making of the Terracotta army looked like a few dozen men in a shed, arguing gently about a shoulder. And that brings us, inevitably, to the faces. Here we must be honest. And being honest here is going to be more restful than being certain, because the certainty on offer is all borrowed. You have heard the loud version, which says that every one of the 8,000 faces is a portrait of a real, specific, named soldier, taken from the living man, so that the Emperor's guard was a guard of individuals. You have also heard the cynical version, which says that there were only a handful of moulds, that the individuality is a story told to tourists, and that if you look closely you will see the same 6 or 8 men repeated over and over like extras in a cheap film. Both of these are tidy. Neither of them is what the evidence says. What the evidence says is that at least 10 face moulds are attested, and I want to be careful with that number, because the line you will see repeated nearly everywhere is that there are 8 basic face shapes, sometimes said to correspond to 8 Chinese characters. That is a popular simplification. It is not a finding. It has been copied from book to book and from screen to screen for decades, the way a small error becomes a large certainty simply by being repeated in a confident voice. At least 10 moulds are documented. There may well be more, and the honest thing is to say that we do not have a final count. Then comes the hand finishing. And the hand finishing is where the argument actually lives. A moulded face came out of its 2 halves as a blank, a general proposition of a face, and then a craftsman sat down with it for a long while. He built the eyebrows up in fresh clay and cut them with a tool. Each one individually he added the moustache. And there are a great many moustaches, drooping, clipped, curled at the tip, waxed up at the ends like something out of a much later century. He worked the cheeks. He set the mouth. He carved the hair, strand by strand, and the top knots, and the plaits at the back, and the little knots and bindings, and the hair alone can take longer than everything below the neck. He gave the man an expression, or something close enough to an expression, that a person 2,200 years afterwards will stand in front of it and feel looked at. And then there are the ears. This is my favourite piece of research in the whole subject, and it is beautifully quiet work. A project called Imperial Logistics, run between University College London and the Emperor Qin Shi Huang's Mausoleum Site Museum, took 3D scans of the left ears of 30 warriors. Just the left ears. The reason is that the human ear is nearly as individual as a fingerprint, an odd little fact about our bodies that has occasionally been used to identify people. The curl of the helix, the fold behind it, the set of the lobe, the small notch beneath the tragus. No 2 of the 30 matched. Not one pair. Marcos Martin Torres, who led that work, suggested that the army looks like a series of portraits of real warriors, and it is a lovely sentence. And I would like it to be true. But hold it lightly, the way you would hold a moth. 30 is not 8,000. Hand-modelled ears made by many different craftsmen would also all differ from one another, without any of those craftsmen ever having looked at a specific man's head. The finding is suggestive, it is genuinely under debate, and the honest answer to the question of whether these are portraits is somewhere between a mould and a portrait, which is exactly where most human work lives anyway. So let us not settle it tonight. Let us leave it beautifully open, and let the not knowing be a soft place to lie down in rather than a thing to worry at, because the not knowing is the truth, and the truth is what we came for. Now the colour, and I need you to do something for me. Take the picture in your head, the one of the grey army, the endless ranks of pale grey clay men under grey museum light, all that dignified stone-coloured solemnity, and set it down, gently, the way you set down a heavy coat at the end of a long day. It is wrong. It is so wrong that if you could stand in Pit 1 on the day it was finished, you would not recognise the place. First came the lacquer. Chi lacquer, the sap of the lacquer tree, tapped and refined and brushed on as a ground layer over the fired clay, 1 or 2 thin coats, and it is a marvellous and thoroughly unpleasant substance. It cures rather than dries, drawing moisture out of the air in order to harden, and it goes on brown and dark and glossy, and it will give some of the people who handle it a rash that lasts for weeks. The entire army had to be lacquered before it could be painted, and the lacquer is the reason for most of the colour that survives, and also, as we shall see in a little while, the reason for one of the most persistent myths about the whole site. Then the paint, cinnabar red, that hot vermilion made from mercury sulfide, which they had in great quantity and were fond of for reasons that become sadder later in the story. Iron oxide dark red, an earthier, brickier red. Malachite green, ground from the copper ore for collars and cuffs and ribbons. Azurite blue. Bone white. Various browns and blacks. And then, unexpectedly, Han purple. Han purple, also called Chinese purple, is a barium copper silicate, and here is the thing about it. It does not occur in nature. It has to be made. It is a synthetic pigment, one of the oldest artificial pigments in the world, produced by cooking the right minerals together at temperatures over 1,000 degrees, most probably as a byproduct of glass making or of alchemy, which in that century were frequently the same room with the same person standing in it. Someone, somewhere in Qin China, was manufacturing a colour that did not exist in the world, and then a hillside of soldiers was painted with it, and then the soldiers were put into a hole. So the army was not grey. The army was loud, pink-faced and pale-eyed, with black hair and black shoes, purple trousers and green collars, red ribbons on the armour, scarlet cords lacing the lamella plates, and the plates themselves picked out so that the light would catch along them. It was garish. To a modern eye it would have looked less like a solemn monument, and rather more like a very large, very serious toy. And every man of it was buried the moment he was finished, in a dark trench under a timber roof, so that nobody would ever see the colour at all. There is a dry little thought in there somewhere about the sort of person who commissions 8,000 hand-painted men and then puts a lid on them. Which brings us to the sad part, and I will keep it short. The paint is still there, on a great many of the figures still in the ground, sealed under 2,000 years of damp loess. And the moment a figure comes up into dry air, the lacquer ground begins to lose its moisture, and as it dries it curls, and as it curls it lifts away from the clay, and it takes the paint with it. Not over months. In about 4 minutes, colour that waited more than 2,000 years can be gone in the time it takes to boil a kettle, in the time it takes a person to walk across a site to fetch a camera. Every early excavator learnt this by standing there and watching it happen. Remember that number, 4 minutes, because it is going to come back at the very end of tonight when we talk about a room that nobody has opened. Now the weapons, briefly, because they were real. This is one of the details that most surprises people. The soldiers were not given props. More than 40,000 bronze items have been recovered from the pits, actual functional weapons, and if you had picked one up on the day it went into the ground, you could have used it on somebody. Arrowheads by the tens of thousands, bundled roughly in hundreds, tied and set into quivers. Crossbow triggers, those beautiful small assemblies of interlocking bronze parts, made to tolerances tight enough that the parts are effectively interchangeable between weapons, which is not a thing that most of the world would manage again for a very long time. Spears, halberds, those long polearms with the hooked blade. Swords, long ones, longer than a person might expect, made possible by a bronze alloy good enough to take that length without snapping. The wooden shafts and the leather bindings and the lacquered scabbards are almost all gone, eaten away by 2,000 years of soil, so what is left is the metal, lying where the wood dissolved out from around it. And it is the metal that gives us tonight's set piece, which is the story of the chromium. You have almost certainly heard this one, because it is irresistible. The story says that when the swords were lifted out of the pits, they were bright. Not green, not crusted, not rotten, bright and sharp and clean, some of them apparently still able to cut. and the story says that analysis found a thin layer of chromium oxide on the blades, a rust-proofing treatment of a kind that would not be developed in the West until the 1930s, which means that Qin metallurgists possessed a lost chromium plating technology 2,000 years ahead of its time. A secret that died with the dynasty. It is a wonderful story. It has been in documentaries and textbooks and museum panels for half a century. It is not true. In 2019, Marcus Martin Torres and his colleagues published the answer in Scientific Reports in Volume 9, Article 5289, and they did it the boring way, which is the only way that ever works. They tested 464 weapons. Of those 464, exactly 37 carried any chromium at all. 37 out of 464. And far more damning, having chromium on you did not correlate with being well preserved. The chromium-bearing weapons were not in better condition than the rest of them. If chromium were a protective coating, that is the one single thing it would have to do, and it did not do it. Then they looked at where the chromium actually sits, and the whole myth came apart in a very gentle way. It clusters at the top of the blade, where the metal met the wooden handle. It clusters on the fittings and the bindings. It is largely absent from the cutting edges, and from the tips of the arrowheads, the places where you would put a rust-proofing layer if you were putting one anywhere at all. And what was at the handle? Lacquer. The wooden hafts were lacquered. The bindings were lacquered. The scabbards were lacquered. The warriors themselves were lacquered, and the lacquer carried chromium in small quantities from whatever went into the making of it. So for 2,000 years, in the wet dark, the lacquer slowly broke down and leached its chromium onto the bronze that it happened to be touching. The famous anti-rust technology of the Qin is a stain. It is the ghost of a wooden handle that rotted away, printed onto the metal it used to hold. So why are the swords bright? Two thoroughly unglamorous reasons, and I love them both. The first is that the bronze itself is excellent, high in tin, deliberately alloyed, well cast, and a high tin bronze is genuinely resistant to corrosion. The second is the ground. That loess we started with, the fine wind-blown silt, is mildly alkaline, very fine-grained, low in organic matter and low in the sort of biological activity that eats metal. It is, entirely by accident, one of the better burial mediums on Earth for bronze. The soil was doing the Qin a 2,000-year favour that nobody asked for and nobody knew about. And I want to land this kindly, because a debunk done badly leaves a person feeling cheated, and nobody can fall asleep while they feel cheated. The truth here is not that they were primitive after all. The truth is that they were superb metallurgists who did not need any magic. They were so good at bronze that people 2,000 years later could not believe it without inventing a lost technology on their behalf. The real achievement was standardization, and alloy control, and quality held steady across 40,000 pieces of work, and that is far harder than a coating. They earned their bright swords honestly. They simply did not earn them the way the story says. And now we come back to the man from the beginning of tonight, because it is time. You remember him. The shed, the lamp, the cold, the finished soldier standing in the straw with his clay still soft enough to take a mark. The foreman who turned the hem of the robe toward the light, down low, near the ankle, in a place where nobody was ever going to look, and pressed a small stamp into it. His name. Gong Chang. Here is what he was doing. More than 80 distinct maker and workshop names have been found on the terracotta figures, stamped or incised, and they are almost never anywhere you would put a signature if you were proud of something. They are on the hem of a robe, under an arm, on the back of a leg, inside a fold, in the places where you would hide a thing. The names divide into groups by their prefixes, and 2 of those groups are large. The first is Gong, which marks the palace workshops, the centralized imperial specialists, the professionals, and the figures carrying the Gong prefix are the most consistent in quality. which is exactly what you would expect from full-time craftsmen with a standard to keep. The second is Xianyang, named for the capital, which marks the municipal and local workshops. Other prefixes are attested too, forms meaning right, and great, and others besides. So we can look at a soldier and say, with reasonable confidence, what kind of workshop made him, and often which foreman stood over the work. And here is why. It was not pride, it was not art, it was not a bid for immortality, and it was not a message to the future. It was the law. The Qin state ran what is politely called a responsibility system, and it worked like this. The maker's name goes on the object, so that when the object fails, the state can walk back along the chain of names and find the hand that made it, and find the foreman who let it out of his shed. A cracked leg, a bad firing, a join that opened in the kiln. Somebody is responsible, and here is his name, pressed into the hem where he put it himself, because putting it there was a regulation, and the penalty for leaving it off was worse than the penalty for the crack. So somewhere in pit 1, or somewhere in the earth beside it that has not yet been opened, there stands a soldier with the name Gongchang pressed into the clay of his robe, and in 1970-something, more than 2,200 years after he did it, somebody knelt down in the dust at the bottom of a trench with a small brush and a lamp, and cleared the dirt out of the hem, and read it, and wrote it in a notebook. That is the whole story of tonight, and here is the shape of it, and I am going to say it once, slowly, and then let it go. He signed it because he was afraid of being fined. He is remembered because of it. The names of these men survive not because anyone wished to honour them, but because the state wished to be able to punish them. There was no monument. There was no gratitude. There was an audit trail. The only reason we know who made the Terracotta Army is bureaucratic suspicion, patient and humorless and permanent, and it accidentally did the one thing that art is supposed to do. We do not know what Gongchang looked like. We do not know his age, or his village, or whether he was any good at the parts of his life that were not clay. We know only that he was careful, and that he was watched, and that he did what he was told, and that in doing what he was told he stepped, without noticing at all, into the only kind of forever that anybody ever actually gets. Not one of the 8,000 soldiers has a name. More than 80 of the men who made them do. So picture it now, at the end of the making. Picture the trenches at dusk, still roofless, and the figures standing in them in their ranks, finished at last. The infantry in their tunics, the armoured men in their lamellar plates, the kneeling archers, the charioteers with the reins in their curled hands, the horses in their teams of 4. Painted, bright wet, looking in the lamplight, red and green and purple and white, and that faint impossible violet that nobody in the world had ever made before this century. Real bronze in their fists, the spearheads catching the light, 40,000 pieces of it lying among them, every eyebrow cut by a person, every ear different from every other ear, every one of them standing quietly in a hole, waiting for the beams to be laid across the top, and on the hem of one of them, down by the ankle, where the lamplight does not quite reach, a small pressed name, put there by a man who only wanted to keep out of trouble. The figures are finished. The workmen are going home for the night, along the road to Lee, in the cold, smelling of clay and lacquer and smoke. Tomorrow the roofing begins, and that is the making of it. 8,000 men who will never be named, made by more than 80 who are. We have spent a long time now among the clay, and the clay has been very patient with us. We have watched the lowest come up out of the hillside in baskets, and be trodden and washed and mixed with sand until it stopped being a hillside and started being a shoulder. We have watched the heads come out of their moulds with their faces still vague, like faces seen through water, and a thumb come along afterwards and give one of them an eyebrow, and then a mouth, and then, somehow, an opinion. And we have knelt down, in our imagination, and read a name pressed into the hem of a robe, low down, where nobody was ever supposed to look. That was an hour of clay. Tonight we owe an hour of people. Because the clay is the part that survived, and so the clay is the part that gets photographed, and the part that gets photographed is the part that gets talked about. But the clay did not lift itself. The clay did not dig 14,000 square meters of trench out of packed Lois with bronze tools and shoulder baskets, and it did not get tired, and it did not get homesick, and it did not lie down at the end of an unimaginable working life and die a very long way from the place where it was born. People did all of that, and this, gently, is where the loud version of the story goes most badly wrong. So settle a little further into wherever you are lying. Let your jaw go loose. Let your hands stop holding anything at all. We are going to walk very slowly through the hardest and most human part of this story, and nothing in it will jump out at you. Let us begin with the number, because the number is the engine of the whole myth, and because the number is not actually a lie. Sima Qian, writing his history about a century after all of this was finished, says that 700,000 conscripted men were set to work. It is a very large number. It is the sort of number that lands in the mind like a dropped stone. And in the loud version of the story, that number belongs entirely to the Terracotta army, and it means 700,000 slaves in one place, all making soldiers, all doomed. But read the sentence slowly, the way you would read a letter from somebody you loved, and two things become clear at once. The first is that the number covers both projects together. Mount Li and the Apang Palace. The tomb and the enormous unfinished pleasure hall down in the capital. Two of the largest construction sites in the ancient world, counted as a single line in a single ledger. The second thing is subtler, and it is the thing a calm reader learns to notice in any old text, in any old language. Very large round numbers in ancient sources are almost never counts. They are gestures. They are a writer's way of saying more than you can picture, more than the eye can hold, more than any honest man could ever tally. He is doing with his brush what you would do with your hands if somebody asked you how many stars there were. This is not an accusation against Sima Qian. He was a superb and careful historian, and later in this story he is going to be proved astonishingly right about something that nobody believed him about for 2,000 years. It is only that a number in an ancient text is a piece of language before it is a piece of arithmetic. So we set the 700,000 down gently, the way we set down the massacre and the magic swords, not as a falsehood, as a shape. A shape meaning vast. And now the correction that quietly dissolves the entire myth, and it is not a dramatic one, it is a filing correction. The workforce at Mount Li was not one thing, it was at least three things, and the difference between them is the whole story. There were first the skilled craftsmen, the men of the palace workshops with the gong prefix on their stamps, and the men of the capital workshops with the Jianyang prefix on theirs, potters and lacquer workers and bronze founders and painters. People whose hands were worth something to the state precisely because those hands were rare. These were not slaves in any sense you would recognize. They were specialists on the imperial books, probably fed reasonably, housed reasonably, and complained about constantly by the men set above them. They were, in the flat vocabulary of administration, an asset. There were, second, the corvée conscripts, and this is the group the modern ear finds hardest to place, because we do not really have a slot for it anymore. A corvée conscript was an ordinary subject of the Qin state who owed the state a certain amount of his labour, rather in the way a modern person owes a certain amount of his income. It was not slavery. It was tax, paid in body. You were registered, because Shangyang's machine had registered everybody. Your county knew that you existed, and how old you were, and roughly what you could lift. And in your turn, when your turn came around, a clerk wrote your name on a list, and you walked to Mount Li with a rolled mat and a spare pair of shoes, and you dug for a season, or a year, or several years. And then, and this is the part that the myth cannot accommodate at all, you went home. You went back to your village, and your millet, and your family, and your ordinary, unremarkable life. Tens of thousands of men cycled through that hillside across nearly 4 decades, and a very great many of them simply left again, and walked back east and died 40 years later in their own beds of something entirely unrelated, having told the story of the strange clay men a few too many times at dinner until their grandchildren stopped listening. That is not a fate anybody would choose, but it is not a massacre either. It is a job you are not allowed to refuse. And there were, third, the Singtu, the convict labourers. And here I am going to slow right down and be very careful, because this is where a certain kind of gentle history goes wrong in the opposite direction, and starts quietly sanding the edges off things that ought to keep their edges. The Singtu were men who had been sentenced, in a legalist state, with a code as fine-meshed and as unforgiving as the Chin Code. An enormous number of ordinary human failures could put a man into that category. Being late, losing a tool, failing to report a neighbour. They were sent to hard labour for terms of years, and some of them worked in iron shackles, and some of them died where they worked. That is forced labour. It is not softened by being legal, and it is not softened by being written down neatly in a good clear hand. So please hear the correction we are actually making, because it is not a kind one. We are not saying that it was pleasant, we are saying that it was not one dramatic night of horror. We are saying it was about 40 years of ordinary, documented bureaucratic grinding, carried out by clerks with brushes and lists, in daylight, entirely within the law. Which is, if you sit with it for a moment, worse. It is worse in a slower way. A massacre is at least an event. This was a routine. And routines do not end. They are simply renewed each spring when the new lists come out. So how do we know any of this? That is a fair question to ask at this hour, and the answer happens in a graveyard. About a kilometre or so from the Great Mound, in flat farmland that has been farmland for as long as anybody can remember, there is a place now called Zaobehu. It is not a monument. There is nothing to look at. It is a labourer's burial ground, and it is exactly what that sounds like. Shallow graves in the loess, dug quickly by tired people at the end of long days, holding the men who did not go home. And in some of those graves, laid in with the body, archaeologists found pieces of broken roof tile. Ordinary tile. Building waste from a site that generated building waste by the mountain, and scratched into that broken tile, in the quick, clear administrative hand of somebody who wrote a great deal every day, is an epitaph. Not a poem. Not a prayer. An entry. It gives the dead man's name. It gives his rank, or his legal status, which in that state came to much the same thing. And it gives his home county, the place that he had walked from, and the place that he was not going to walk back to. Sit with that for a little while, because it is worth more than every dragon in every story that has ever been told about that hill. Somebody, at the end of a long day, on a site of mud and smoke and noise, with 100 more urgent things to be doing, picked up a broken piece of roof and took a stylus and wrote down where a dead stranger had come from and put it in the ground with him. We do not know why. We can guess that it was administrative, that a body was a line item and that lines must be closed. It was probably nothing more than paperwork. And yet a man could have been dropped into a hole in the dark with nothing at all, at no cost, with no consequence whatsoever. And instead somebody knelt down in the cold with a broken tile and wrote his name and his county on it. Whatever the reason was, the effect, 2,200 years later, is that we can read it. 17 individuals have been identified this way so far. And when you look at where they came from, the map does something quietly devastating. 10 of them came from what is now Shandong, 3 from what is now Henan, 3 from what is now Hebei, 1 from what is now Jiangsu. Every single one of them from the east, every single one of them from the old conquered kingdoms, from places that had been countries within the lifetimes of the men who were buried there. They were not local. Not one of them was local. The men who died building the first Emperor's eternity were, almost to a man, from somewhere that the first Emperor had recently finished erasing. And there is one more detail in that cemetery, and it is so small that it is easy to walk straight past it. They were not thrown in at random. They were buried grouped. Grouped by rank, which is what you would expect from a state that could not stop sorting things. But also grouped by region of origin. Men from the same country laid near their own, the Shandong men over here, the Henan men over there, whether that was the tidiness of the clerk or the last small decency of the men who dug the graves, who happened to be the dead man's countryman and who put him next to somebody he could have talked to, we cannot possibly know, and we should not pretend to. But the pattern is in the ground. Somebody sorted the dead by where they had been born, which is a thing you only do if it has occurred to you that where a person was born might matter to him, which is, I think, the smallest possible quantity of mercy that can still be measured. And it is measurable. And it is there. Not every grave is like that. There is another site, called Shanrun, and it is not a cemetery. It is a pit. 14 individuals, laid in without arrangement, without order, without tiles, without names, and some of them were still wearing iron leg shackles when they went in. I am going to give you that fact plainly, and then I am going to move on. Because the facts here are perfectly capable of doing their own work without any help from me. 14 men, no names, iron on their legs, buried, in the end, by somebody in a hurry. That is what is in the ground at Shanrun, and it has been in the ground at Shanrun the entire time, under wheat, under ploughs, under a great many perfectly happy afternoons. And now we come to the strangest and softest thing in this whole long night, and I want you to be very comfortable for it, because this is the part of the story that I think about when I cannot sleep. In 2016, a team led by Ma and colleagues published a study in the journal Scientific Reports. What they did was chemistry, and the chemistry was done on bone. Here is how it works, and it is worth understanding, because once you understand it, you will never look at a museum case in quite the same way again. Everything you eat becomes you. Not as a metaphor. Physically, the carbon and the nitrogen in your food are taken apart in your gut and rebuilt into your body, and the particular flavours of those elements, the isotopes, arrive in different proportions depending on what kind of plant you ate and on whether an animal ate the plant before you did. And your bone keeps a running average. For years. Your skeleton is quietly the most honest diary you will ever keep, and you cannot edit it, and you cannot lose it, and it does not care in the slightest what you told people at the time. So they read the diaries. They read the bones of the people of Lii, the town founded beside the necropolis to service the works. The locals, potters and cooks and clerks and their wives and their children, living an ordinary chin life next door to an extraordinary hole in the ground. And the bones said millet. Millet, and more millet, and a decent share of animal protein alongside it. Exactly the diet you would expect from settled local people in that valley, in that century, eating what their parents had eaten, off their own land, at their own table. And then they read the bones of the men from Shanrun. And the bones said something else entirely. The signature was different. It pointed south. It pointed away from the millet country of the Qin heartland and toward a mixed diet of the kind eaten in the old state of Chu, in what is now Hubei. Rice country. River country. Somewhere altogether else, hundreds and hundreds of kilometres from that hillside, with a different climate and a different accent and different food on the table. And there was one more thing in the numbers, and it is the thing that stays with me. They had eaten markedly less animal protein. Markedly, which matches the written record of what convicts were issued under that system. Coarse millet rations, calculated, allocated, sufficient to keep a man working and no more. So here is what actually happened, and I am going to say it once, slowly, at the lowest volume I have. 2,200 years after they died, in a laboratory, chemistry read their last years, and chemistry found that they were foreigners, badly fed, and a very long way from home. Let that sit there for a moment in the dark, and then let us move gently on, because they would not thank us for staring. But notice, before we go, what has just happened to the myth. The loud story needs these men to be a nameless, anonymous mass, because an anonymous mass is easier to feel one big simple feeling about. They were not a mass. They were 17 men from Shandong and Henan and Hebei and Jiangsu, and 14 men from the south with iron on their legs, and tens of thousands more who dug for a season and then walked home, and more than 80 craftsmen who signed their work in the hem because the law required it. Their names, their ranks, their home counties, and the chemistry of their own bones all outlived the empire that made them. That is not one thing. That is a society, doing an enormous job badly and slowly and for far too long. Which brings us, at last, to the massacre. And I want to be precise here, because the myth did not come from nowhere, and the people who repeat it are not being stupid. There is a real sentence underneath it. Sima Shan does write that when the emperor was finally laid in, the middle gate was dropped and the outer gate was closed, and the artisans who had built the mechanisms were shut inside, and none of them came out again. That is in the Shiji. That is the seed. And it may very well be true, because it has a horrible logic to it that fits the man and fits the state. Think about who those men were. Not labourers, not potters. They were the ones who had built the crossbows that were rigged to fire at anyone who entered. They were the ones who had made the Mercury move. They were the ones who knew where every trap was, and which corridor turned, and which one did not. A small number of highly skilled men carrying about in their heads the complete plan of the most valuable room in the world. In a state that thought about problems the way that Qin thought about problems, that is not a crime of passion. It is a security measure. It is, appallingly, a line in a procedure. But look at what that sentence covers, and look at what it does not. It covers the burial chamber. A small group. Men who worked inside the tomb itself, at the very end, in the last days. It does not cover the Terracotta army, and it never did. The pits are 1.5 kilometers away to the east, a completely different operation, on a different site, on a different schedule, run by different offices, filled and roofed and sealed, long before the old man ever came home in his fish cart. The people who made the army were not anywhere near that chamber. They were in sheds and kilns and trenches and, in tens of thousands of cases, back home in the east, telling a story that nobody entirely believed. And so the 700,000 were not killed to keep the secret. There was no night of blood on that hillside. There are graves, yes, and the shackles are real, and the coarse rations are real, and the men who died of exhaustion at 30 are real. But they died the way the poor have always died on the great works of the powerful, which is one at a time over years of ordinary causes, and then they were buried by their friends with a piece of roof tile. Attrition, not slaughter. Decades, not a night. And you may find, as I do, that this makes the thing sadder rather than less sad, because a massacre is at least a decision that somebody has to make. This was nobody's decision. This was simply how the machine ran when it was running well. And here is the last thing, which is the strangest of all, and which we are going to leave sitting quietly in the dark for a while, because it belongs to a later part of the night. If you wanted to keep a secret, killing everybody who knows, it is an enormous amount of trouble to go to. And it turns out that it was not necessary, because the secret kept itself. Sima Qian, writing about a century later, with access to the imperial archives, the greatest historian in the whole long history of that country, describes this tomb in loving and specific detail. He tells us about the rivers of mercury and the pearls set into the ceiling to be the stars, and the crossbows, and the candles of whale oil that were meant to burn forever. He is thorough. He is generous with detail. And about 8,000 life-sized painted clay men standing in ranks a kilometre and a half to the east, he says nothing at all. Not a line, not a word, not a rumour, not a dismissal, not even a note that some people say such a thing exists. Nothing, no massacre was required to bury the Terracotta Army. People simply stopped mentioning it. That is all it takes. We will come back to this. Now let us leave the graveyards and go and find the Emperor, because he is not well. Picture him in his 40s, because he never reached his 50s. Picture a man who has done genuinely the largest thing that anybody in that part of the world had ever done. 7 kingdoms made into one. 1 script, 1 coin, 1 weight, 1 measure. 1 axle width for every cart on every road in the world. A wall going up in the north under Mungtian. And the only remaining problem, the one file that keeps coming back to his desk, is that he is going to die. He cannot standardize that. It will not take an instruction. So he does what powerful people have always done with an unacceptable answer, which is to go and find a different one. He tours 5 great progresses out across his new empire, east toward the sea, because the sea is where the answer is supposed to be. He climbs the sacred mountains and has inscriptions cut into the living rock in the new standard script, explaining, at length and in the third person, that everything is now correct. He hears about islands out in the Eastern Ocean where the immortals live, and where the herb grows that makes death optional. And he sends Shufu, a court magician of considerable presence and, one suspects, considerable nerve, out over the water with ships and supplies to go and find it. Shufu sails east. Shufu does not come back. Shufu, it is generally felt, made the correct career decision, having accurately calculated the difference between an ocean and a report, and meanwhile the alchemists at court are working the other angle, which is chemical. They are men of learning. Their theories are not silly, they are simply wrong in a way that would take another 1,500 years to detect. Their reasoning goes something like this. Things that rot are soft and warm and wet and alive, and in the end they turn to nothing at all. Things that endure are hard and cold and bright and mineral, and they do not change. Gold does not rust. Jade does not rot. Cinnabar is that astonishing red, and when you heat it, it gives up a silver liquid that runs about like a live thing, and never tarnishes, and never dulls, and never dies. So if you want the qualities of the mineral, you take the mineral into yourself. It is elegant reasoning. It has symmetry. And what it means in practice is that the most powerful man in the world spends his final years being fed measured doses of mercury and cinnabar by his most trusted advisors as medicine at considerable expense, with everybody's very best wishes. Mercury poisoning does not kill a man cleanly. It comes for the nerves first, and then for the mind. Tremor, sleeplessness, irritability, then a suspicion that will not be argued with. The historical record gives us, in these years, an emperor who cannot sleep, who moves between his palaces so that nobody can know which one he is in, who has covered walkways built between them so that he can travel unseen, and who becomes progressively less able to bear being contradicted. We should not diagnose a dead man from 2,000 years away, and I am not going to. But it is very hard to read that description and not notice how neatly it matches the symptoms of the cure. And it is in that condition, in 213 before the Common Era and in the years after it, that the ugliest business of the reign takes place, the burning of the books and the killing of the scholars. The traditional account is that Li Si argued that men who read old histories will inevitably compare the current arrangement unfavourably with an arrangement that has the enormous advantage of being over, and that the state would run more smoothly if the histories of the conquered kingdoms were gathered up and destroyed. And so, we are told, they were. Everything but the practical books. Medicine kept, agriculture kept, divination kept, one official copy of the rest retained in the imperial library, and the remainder burned in the yards. And then the scholars, 460 of them by the traditional figure, buried alive. Later historians have doubted the details, and the number, and the burying, and some of it may be harm propaganda painting a fallen dynasty in its very worst colours. Probably some of it happened. Probably not exactly like that. Only notice, quietly, and then let it go, the one official copy of everything was kept in the Imperial Library at Jianyang, which burned in the general collapse a few years later, along with everything else. Centralizing a thing is perfectly safe right up until the center catches. And then, in 210 before the Common Era, on the road, it ends. He is on his 5th Eastern tour. He is 49 years old, which was not young in that world but was not old either, and at a place called Shekyu, which means sand dune, which is a very plain name for the place where the largest man in the world stops. The first emperor dies in his carriage, a long way from his capital, in the summer heat, in the middle of a moving column of thousands of people who have absolutely no idea that anything has happened. And here the story becomes, briefly, absurd, and I want to tell you this part softly, because I do not think it is a horror story at all. I think it is a farce, and it may be the truest thing in the entire biography. Zhao Gao, the chief eunuch, and Li Si, the chancellor, are standing in a tent with a dead emperor and a succession that has not been settled, and an empire that is 15 years old and held together entirely by the belief that this one specific man is still alive. If word gets out on that road, it is over long before they reach the walls. So they decide between the two of them that the emperor is not dead. He is merely unwell and resting and not receiving. The column moves on. The imperial carriage travels in the middle of it, curtained, as it always has. Meals are carried in at the proper hours, with the proper ceremony, by servants who are not told, and they are carried out again afterwards, untouched, by servants who are also not told. Reports are brought to the carriage. Decisions come back out of it in the emperor's script in Zhao Gao's hand, because Zhao Gao is the one who keeps the seal. The officials bow at the curtain, as they have always bowed at the curtain, and the whole enormous apparatus of the most centralized state on earth goes on functioning perfectly around a man who has stopped. But it is a Chinese summer, and it is a very long way to Shanyang, and there is a difficulty, and the difficulty grows daily, and it cannot be commanded to stop. And so an order goes out that a cart of salted fish is to be attached to the procession and driven along beside the imperial carriage, and then another, and then a train of them, on the stated grounds that the emperor has developed a taste for it. Cartloads of abalone and saltfish, ripening steadily in the sun, wheel to wheel with the carriage, so that nobody along that road could possibly distinguish one smell from the other. And it works. It works completely. Nobody notices. The column comes down out of the east at its stately pace, day after day after day, in a travelling cloud of fish, and the banners go up in the morning and come down at night, and the dead man is carried home in state, in absolute secrecy, in the most conspicuous procession in the world. I have never been able to find that grim. I find it almost tender, in a way I cannot entirely explain. Here is a man who spent 38 years and the wealth of 7 kingdoms building a room inside a mountain so that he would never have to be an ordinary corpse, who sent ships over the horizon to buy an extra century, who took the shining metal into his own body because it did not tarnish. And what he gets, in the end, is the thing that every one of us gets, which is that the world carries you home as best it can, with whatever it happens to have to hand, and does its awkward, improvising best to be kind about the details. He wanted to be exempt. He was not exempt. Nobody has ever been exempt. Immortality, as we have said, is a very difficult thing to schedule. So let us leave him there, on the long road west, in the summer of 210 before the Common Era. The column moving at walking pace across the plain, the dust hanging behind it in the late light and settling slowly onto the millet. The curtains of the carriage drawn and still, the seal riding in its box, the fish carts creaking along beside it, load after load all the way home. And ahead of them, still a good many days away, the mountain, and the mound, and the doors that are waiting to be sealed. And 1.5 kilometres to the east of all of it, roofed over in the dark, already finished and already forgotten, 8,000 painted men standing in perfect ranks, waiting for absolutely nobody. In the late summer of 210 before the Common Era, the long slow procession finally came back to Zhanyang, and the carts of salted fish were unhitched, and the pretense was allowed to end. The first emperor had been dead for many weeks by then, carried west along his own beautiful straight roads in a closed carriage, with his ministers bringing meals in to him and carrying the same meals out again, and now at last he was permitted to be dead in public. The mourning was declared. The court did the things that courts do when a very large man stops existing, which is mostly paperwork. And then, quietly, in the ordinary way that even the least ordinary bodies are moved, Ying Zheng was carried a short distance east, out of the capital along the pale roads to the foot of Mount Li, where a hill that was not really a hill had been rising for 38 years, waiting for exactly this, waiting for him. Since the year he was a boy of 13 who had not yet learned to shave, he had begun building this room before he had anything to put inside it. He had spent his entire reign on an address he sincerely hoped never to use. And now he arrived, on time, for the only appointment he had never wanted to keep. Let us go into the mountain with him for a little while, not because it is frightening, but because it is quiet in there, and because tonight the quiet is rather the point. We do not know what that day looked like. Nobody wrote it down in the way we would like, but we know the shape of it, and we know the season, and we know the ground, and we can let ourselves imagine, softly, the long line of carts on the flat land east of the capital, the dust hanging in the warm air, the smell of the river and the millet fields, the ordinary farmers standing back from the road with their hands still dirty, watching a very great deal of something go slowly past them and not knowing what any of it was for. That is a thing worth holding on to tonight. Almost nobody involved knew what any of it was for. That was rather the design. Sima Qian, writing about a century afterwards, tells us what was inside. He tells it in that flat, careful, unhurried way of his, the way a man writes when he is copying down what reached him rather than what he saw. He writes that the workmen dug down through 3 springs, that they poured bronze to seal the floor, and that the coffin was brought down and set in place. He writes that the chamber was filled with the treasures and the rare things of the whole empire, all the accumulated beautiful objects of 7 kingdoms folded into one dark room. He writes that the palaces and the towers and the offices of the empire were built there in miniature, laid out on the floor, an entire country made small enough to be walked around by a dead man. He writes that the 100 waterways of the land were made there, and the great river Yangtze, and the Yellow River, and that they were made of mercury, and that some mechanism was arranged so that the mercury flowed, so that the rivers of the empire ran and ran and ran under the mountain, silver and heavy and patient, going nowhere at all, very slowly forever. He writes that above all of this the heavens were set out, the constellations, the sky itself, fixed to the ceiling and studded with pearls. He writes that crossbows were rigged and strung so that anyone who came in through the passages would be shot without anybody needing to be awake to do it. And he writes that candles were made from the fat of whales, because whale oil burns for a very long time, and the intention, quite plainly stated, was that these candles should never go out. It is the most extraordinary description of a room in the whole of ancient literature, and it is worth noticing what is being described. It is not a grave. A grave is a hole with a person in it. This is a working model of the world, with weather and geography and stars, and a functioning security system and lighting arrangements, built underground, at enormous cost for one resident, and then closed. It is a snow globe with an emperor in it, and whether or not you believe every line of it tonight, and we will come back to that question much later and rather gently, the ambition of it is not in doubt, because the ambition is sitting there on the surface. The hill above it is still there. You can go and stand on it. It is about 76 meters high now, worn down by rain and roots and 2,000 years of perfectly ordinary weather, and it was probably nearer 115 meters when it was new, when the earth on it was still raw and the terraces were still sharp, before the grass and the pomegranate trees got hold of it. It is a mountain that was carried there by people in baskets. That is the part that never quite fits in the mind. Every one of those cubic meters arrived on somebody's shoulder. And then, having brought him in, they closed it. Sima Chan tells us the middle gate was let down and the outer gate lowered behind it, and that the men who had built the inner mechanisms were shut inside, because they knew where the traps were, and knowledge of that kind was regarded as a design flaw. We will come back to that line too, because it is the seed of the great myth, and we spent our last hour taking that myth apart. For tonight it is enough to say that the door came down, and the grass was planted on top, and the mountain was made to look like a mountain, and that was that. But the mountain is not where the army is. The army is somewhere else, and this is the part I want you to hold as you drift, because it is quietly the strangest thing in the entire story. About 1.5 kilometers to the east, out past the walls, out in the flat farmland, in those long parallel trenches the surveyors had marked out in the Loess, 8,000 men stood in the dark in perfect order, freshly painted, holding real bronze weapons, in ranks, at attention, facing east. And over them the workers laid the roof. Heavy timber beams laid across the trenches from side to side, thick pine and other good hard wood, hauled in from wherever the Empire could find trees, because the lowest plain around Xianyang was not exactly a forest. Then woven mats laid over the beams, layer on layer, Fibrian reed, to keep the soil out. Then rammed earth on top of the mats, packed down hard in courses, the same way the walls of every Qin town were made, layer after layer after layer, beaten flat with wooden rams by people who had done this all their lives and could do it half asleep. And then, when the last of the earth went on, and the light narrowed to a line and then to nothing, and the mats settled, and the dust came down through the beams and drifted onto the painted shoulders of the front rank, it was finished. Here is the plain sentence, and I would like to just set it down and leave it lying there rather than make a fuss of it. The army was buried on the day it was finished. It was never meant to be looked at. Not once. Not by anyone. Not by the emperor, who was dead. And not by his son. And not by the priests. And not by the men who made it, who were sent home or sent on to the next trench. There was no unveiling. There was no procession past the ranks. There was no moment when somebody stood at the head of Pit 1 with a lamp and admired the work. It went from the kiln to the trench to the dark, and the dark was the point. Every eyebrow that somebody had cut into wet clay with the edge of a tool, every moustache, every knot of hair, every fingernail, every strap and buckle and knuckle and thread. Every single one of those small, careful decisions that we spent the last hour admiring was made for an audience of exactly one man, and he was dead before the roof went on, and he could not have seen it in any case, because he was 1.5 kilometers away, under a different pile of earth, lying in a bronze room with silver rivers going round his feet. And they did it anyway. They did it to the same standard all the way through. There is no back row that got sloppy. There is no corner where somebody, knowing perfectly well that no living eye would ever fall on this, simply stopped bothering. That is not a fact about the emperor. That is a fact about the workers, and it is one of the kindest facts I know. Now, before we let the silence come down, there is one more hole in the ground to mention, and it is my favourite hole in the world. There is a fourth pit. It was dug. It was properly dug, to the proper depth, in the proper place, in the proper shape, by people who were expecting to fill it. And it is empty. There is nothing in it. There was never anything in it. The trench was cut, and then the world that was supposed to fill it stopped existing, and the shovels went away, and the Lois quietly began sliding back down the sides in that patient way that Lois has, and nobody ever came back. Pit 4 is the sound of a sentence stopping in the middle. It is the most eloquent absence in archaeology, and the reason it is empty is the whole of the next few minutes, so let us take those minutes slowly, because they are not dramatic, whatever you may have been told. Empires do not usually fall over, they mostly just stop being paid attention to. Huai became the second emperor, which was not the plan, or rather it was somebody's plan, but not his father's. Zhao Gao, the chief eunuch, and Li Si, the chancellor, had already forged their way past the elder son Fusu out on that long road home, and Fusu, who was a decent man in a family in a system that did not reward that, obeyed the letter he was sent and took his own life, and Meng Tian, the general of the northern frontier, was removed as well, and so within a season the empire had lost. In no particular order, the only man who had built it, the only son who might have run it, and the only general who could have held it. What remained were 2 administrators and a young man who liked pleasure and had never been told no. It went about as well as you would expect. The machine kept running for a while, because that is what machines do, and it is important to understand that the Qin state was above all a machine. It ran on schedules, it ran on quotas, it ran on the absolute predictability of punishment, which had been Shang Yang's great insight 150 years earlier, that if the law is applied to everybody with the reliability of gravity, then people will arrange their lives around it exactly as they arrange their lives around gravity. That works magnificently, right up until the moment when following the law and surviving become 2 different activities. In 209 before the Common Era, in a place far from anywhere, a group of about 900 conscripts was being marched to a garrison post, and it rained. It rained the way it rains in that part of the world, for days, and the roads turned to a kind of brown paste, and the group could not move, and it became mathematically certain that they were going to arrive late. 2 of the officers in charge were named Chen Sheng and Wu Guang. They were not aristocrats. They were not generals. They were ordinary men of the sort the Qin registers counted by the thousand, and they sat in the rain and did the arithmetic that the state itself had taught them to do, because the state had made the arithmetic very simple. The penalty for arriving late was death. The penalty for rebellion was death. When a government makes those 2 numbers the same, it has, without meaning to, removed every reason not to rebel. And so they rebelled, essentially on the grounds that they might as well. The empire that was meant to last 10,000 generations, the empire whose founder had counted his successors forward into the far future and named himself merely the first of them, the empire of 1 script and 1 coin and 1 axle width, came apart in about 15 years, and the first push came from 2 damp men with a scheduling problem. There is a certain justice in a state that lived by its paperwork being killed by its own late fee. What followed was several years of the ordinary miserable business of a large country coming apart, and I will not spend your sleep on it, because it is loud and it is far away, and it does not need us tonight. Armies moved. Cities changed hands. Shang Yu, the warlord of Chu, came west with the old grievances of a conquered kingdom behind him, and Liu Bang, who would eventually win everything and found the Han dynasty and be remembered as the more sensible of the 2, came west by another road. In 206 before the Common Era, Shanyang was taken and sacked. The Shiji says the fires in the palaces burned for a long while, and gives a figure for the burning that is one of those enormous round rhetorical numbers we have learned to treat kindly. The capital of the first empire in Chinese history was reduced, in the space of a season, to a burnt field with some post holes in it. And out east of the mound, in the farmland, somebody found the trenches. We do not know exactly who, and this is one of the places where I would like to be careful with you, because the story is usually told with more confidence than the evidence deserves. Tradition blames Xiang Yu, and tradition has a reasonable case. The Shiji says he burned the Qin palaces, and that he had the tomb opened and looted, and he had every conceivable motive, being a man of Chu, whose kingdom Qin had swallowed, standing in the ruins of the state that had swallowed it. It fits. But fitting is not the same as being proved, and the honest position tonight is that it is probable and not certain. Other explanations survive. Some scholars have suggested a deliberate ritual burning, the formal killing of the grave goods, a thing done on purpose as part of the funeral of a dynasty rather than as vandalism. Others have pointed out, rather deflatingly, that a great deal of timber buried in damp earth with organic matting can, in the right conditions, heat itself and catch fire without any help from anybody at all, and that the pits may simply have burned themselves down over years like an enormous compost heap with opinions. We do not know. What we do know is the physical fact, because the physical fact is still there in the ground and can be looked at. The pits were opened. The bronze weapons, which were real and sharp and immediately useful to anyone fighting a war, were taken. That much is obvious from the empty hands. And the roofs burned. You can see it. The fire damage is plain in Pit 1 and in Pit 2, scorched earth and charcoal, and the particular colour that clay goes when it is fired a second time by accident. The heavy beams burned through, and then the beams did what burned beams do. They came down, and they brought the rammed earth and the mats and the 2,000 years of everything above them down with them, onto the heads and the shoulders of 8,000 painted men standing at attention in the dark. And every single one of them fell. This is the part that most people never quite absorb, and I would like to say it very plainly and then let it rest. There is no intact army. There never was one. Not for us. Not one of those figures was found standing. Not one. Every warrior you have ever seen in a photograph, every calm, broad face in every documentary, every general and archer and charioteer standing in that great hall under the arched roof in the light, is a repair. Each one was found as a scatter of fragments in a crushed layer of earth and charcoal, and was lifted out piece by piece, and numbered, and laid out on a table, and put back together by a human being with glue and patience and an enormous amount of time. We will come back to those tables. For now it is enough to know that what fell in about 206 before the Common Era did not get up again by itself, and that every soldier standing today is standing because somebody in the last 50 years chose to spend months of their one life on him. Which brings me to the kneeling archer, who is going to keep us company for the rest of tonight. Of all the thousands of figures, the best preserved is a man kneeling. He is down on his right knee with his left knee up, his back straight, his hands held as though drawing a crossbow that is no longer there, his armour plates carved down his back, and on the soles of his shoes, which are turned toward you because he is kneeling, the sculptor cut the tread. The pattern of the sole, denser stitching at the ball of the foot and the heel where a real shoe wears, because somebody thought about how a real shoe wears, on a figure who is going into the dark forever, on a part of him that faces backwards. He came out of the ground in better condition than almost any of his colleagues, and he still carries visible traces of his colour, and he is the one they put on the stamps and the posters. And the reason he survived when the enormous burning roof came down on the whole formation is not glorious in the slightest. He survived because he was short. He was kneeling, and so he was low, and the falling beams passed over the top of his head and smashed the standing men on either side of him instead. 2,000 years of survival purchased entirely by not standing up. I find that a very restful thought, and I offer it to you without further comment as you lie there, low to the ground, in the dark, not standing up. And then, nothing. This is the long part of the night, and I want to take it slowly, because nothing is what actually happened next, and it happened for a very, very long time. The fires went out, the earth over the pits settled and sank a little, the way disturbed ground always does, so that the fields above them lay in the faintest of hollows that nobody ever noticed. The Han dynasty came under Liu Bang and put the country back together with a lighter hand and a great deal of the same machinery. because the chin machine was too useful to throw away and they mostly just filed the sharp edges off it. Farmers came back to the loess. They planted millet because millet is what that soil wants. They planted wheat later. They dug irrigation. They had children. The children had children. And directly beneath their feet, at a depth of about 5 meters, 8,000 men lay on their faces in the dark, in pieces, in silence, going nowhere. Sima Qian was born in about 145 before the Common Era. He grew up, he inherited his father's work and his father's obsession. He suffered appallingly for saying an honest thing to an emperor who did not want to hear it, and he chose to live in disgrace rather than die and leave the book unfinished, which is one of the great quiet acts of courage in the history of writing. He gathered everything. He went and looked at places. He read the archives. And around 94 before the Common Era he finished the Shiji, and in it he described the tomb of the first emperor in the loving, precise, unhurried detail we walked through at the start of tonight. The mercury rivers, the pearls, the crossbows, the whale oil candles, and he does not mention the army. Not a word, not a line, not a hint. The greatest historian of the ancient Chinese world, working roughly a century after the event, with access to the imperial archives and to the descendants of people who were there, describes that hill in more detail than he describes almost anything else, and he has apparently never heard of the 8,000 men standing in the field beside it. Nobody wrote them down. Nobody needed to be killed to keep the secret. The secret kept itself, by the simple and terrible mechanism of nobody thinking it was worth a sentence. And then the centuries just went by. The Han gave way, and there were the divided years, and then the Tang came, and Chang'an, which is the same city as Shan, became for a while the largest city on the face of the earth. 1 million people, camels in the streets, foreign merchants, poetry, and the whole of that immense and glittering world happened about 30 kilometers from 8,000 buried men, and not one of those poets ever knew. The Song came. The Yuan. The Ming, who built walls of their own on the same principle and in the same spirit, and roughly for the same reasons. The Qing. Persimmon trees were planted above the pits, because persimmons like that ground, and every autumn for hundreds of years the fruit turned that particular soft orange and dropped, and rotted, and fed the soil, and the soil went down. Ploughs went over them, year after year, generation after generation, drawn by oxen, and then by mules, and then eventually by small loud engines, turning the top 20 centimeters of the earth above the greatest sculpture project in the ancient world, and finding nothing, because the army was a good deal deeper than a plough. Rain fell on the mound. Roots got into it. The mound got smaller, 40 meters smaller, 1 grain at a time. Children climbed it, because it is a hill, and it is what hills are for. Somebody, at some point, almost certainly had a picnic on the tomb of the first emperor of China and complained about the wind. Nothing happened, slowly, for 2,184 years. Except that it was not quite nothing, and this is the loveliest small fact in the whole chapter. They were found before. More than once. Over those long centuries, people digging in that field, for wells or for graves or for foundations, occasionally hit something hard and strange about a meter or two down, and brought up a piece of fired clay in the shape of a hand, or a shoulder, or a face. And they looked at it. And they thought about it. And they put it back. There are scattered reports across the local record of exactly this, of figures struck and figures reburied, and the reasoning is entirely reasonable if you are a farmer standing in your own field with a clay man staring up at you out of the hole you have just dug. This is an earth god. This is a spirit thing. This is unlucky. This is not mine. And so they filled the hole in and moved the well 2 meters to the left and said nothing and got on with their lives, and the army went back to sleep. For 2,000 years the Terracotta army was found repeatedly, and politely, firmly, sensibly refused every single time by people who had quite enough to be getting on with. I am rather fond of them. They were not wrong. It was unlucky. Ask the dynasty. What finally changed was not curiosity. It was the weather. In the early part of 1974, there was a drought in that part of Shaanxi, the ordinary, grinding, unphotogenic kind of drought that does not make history, only makes work. The rain did not come, and the streams thinned, and the water table under the lowest dropped, and the wells that had served Xiang village went low and then went dry, and the persimmon grove needed water, and the people needed water, and so a decision was made of the sort that has been made in that landscape for 4,000 years. Dig a new well. Dig it deeper than the old ones, because the water has gone down. Dig it, in fact, deeper than anybody in that village had needed to dig for a very long time, which is the only reason any of what follows happened at all. In March of 1974, a man named Yang Jifa and his brothers, together with their neighbour Wang Puji and some others from the production team, went out into the persimmon grove with picks and baskets and began to sink a well about 1.5 kilometres east of the old mound that everybody had always assumed was just a hill. It was cold work and ordinary work. The lowest came up in the pale dry crumbs it always comes up in. They went down through the topsoil and through the ploughed layer and into the older ground beneath, and at about 1 metre down one of the picks went into something that was not earth and did not sound like a stone, and came away with a piece of hard curved fired clay on the end of it. They kept digging, because that is what you do. There were more pieces. There were bricks, oddly old ones, the wrong shape. There were fragments of bronze, green and light. And then, in the loose fill at the bottom of the hole, in the ordinary cold March daylight of a bad dry spring, they brought up a head. It came out face upward. 2,184 years after the roof came down on him. After the fires and the Han and the Tang and the Song and the Ming and the Qing and the persimmons and the ploughs and all the small polite refusals of all those sensible farmers, a man made of clay looked at the sky again. He had a topknot. He had eyebrows. He had a calm, broad, patient face. And somewhere under his robe, low down on the hem where nobody would ever think to look, he almost certainly had a name pressed into him by somebody who had been worried about a fine. They set him on the edge of the hole in the dirt, and they stood around him, and they looked at him, and he looked back, and none of them yet had the faintest idea, and the light was very ordinary, and the field was very quiet, and that is where we will leave it for tonight. Sleep well. He waited 2,000 years for the daylight. He can certainly wait until morning for the rest. The head came up out of the well and into the light of a March morning, and then, for quite a long while, nothing much happened at all. That is generally how the largest discoveries begin. There is no music. There is only a man standing waist deep in a hole with a piece of somebody's face in his hands, and a slow, sinking suspicion that he has ruined his own afternoon. The well diggers of Xiang village had been looking for water. They had found a kiln, they thought, or a temple, or an old god, and none of those things would fill a bucket. So they set the head aside on the loess and went back down and kept digging. Because the persimmon trees were thirsty, and the drought did not care what was under the field. Some of the pieces went home in baskets. A few of the bronze arrowheads were carried off, or traded, or laid on a windowsill as curiosities, the way a person keeps an interesting stone. One clay head sat for some days in the corner of a yard, keeping quiet company with a spade and a coil of rope. And this, too, is part of the story we are telling tonight, that the Terracotta army did not arrive with a fanfare and a spotlight. It was carried up out of the ground in handfuls by tired men in a bad year, and it was very nearly put back. Then, a man named Zhao Kangmin came out from the county cultural centre with a handcart. He was the sort of official every country keeps a few of and never quite pays properly. A person whose job title is vague and whose actual work is to notice things. He walked around the well. He looked at the fragments the villagers had gathered, and the fragments still lying in the spoil heap, and he understood in the general way what he was looking at, and in the specific way that nobody was going to help him. So he loaded the pieces onto his cart, 3 cartloads of them by most accounts, and he wheeled them back to a small office in Lintong, and he began, on a desk, to glue an empire back together. This is worth resting on for a moment, because the picture is so unlike the picture we all carry. The first restoration of the Terracotta army did not happen in a laboratory. It happened at a table in a county office, with paste and patience, and a man working out which shoulder belonged to which arm, alone, in the evenings. 2 figures rose that way, more or less whole, before anybody in the capital had heard a word about it. He also, being a cautious man in a cautious decade, did not shout about it, which is why the news travelled the way news travels in real life, sideways and by accident. A journalist named Lin Anwen came through on other business, heard about the clay men, and wrote a report. The report reached Beijing, and in July of 1974, 4 months after the head came up, an excavation team arrived at the Persimmon Grove under the leadership of a quiet archaeologist named Yuan Zhongyi, born in 1932, who would spend the rest of his working life on that one field, become the director of the museum built over it, and be called, eventually and accurately, the father of the Terracotta army. He arrived expecting to be there for a week. He stayed for decades. That is a thing this field does to people. Now comes the part of the story that is best told slowly, because the pleasure of it is entirely in the slowness. The team began to open the ground, and the ground kept going. They found a figure, and beside it another figure, and behind those a rank, and behind that rank a corridor of rammed earth, and behind that corridor another corridor, and the field, which was an ordinary field with an ordinary well in it, kept turning out to be the roof of something. Trench by trench, season by season, the shape came clear. Pit 1 is about 230 metres long and about 62 metres wide. That is roughly 14,000 square metres of buried men, which is a number that means nothing until you stand at one end of it and cannot comfortably see the faces at the other. Inside it, by the best estimate, stand something like 6,000 figures, arranged in 11 long parallel corridors, an infantry formation facing east in ranks, with a vanguard out in front, unarmoured, ready to move. Of those 6,000, around 2,000 have so far been raised, mended and set back on their feet. Which means, and it is important to say this plainly, and without any drama whatsoever, that most of the Terracotta army is still in the ground tonight. It is under a roof now, and it is catalogued and it is watched over by people who love it, but it is lying where it fell, in the dark, in pieces, in the same earth it has been lying in since the roof came down. The hall you have seen photographs of is not the army. It is the part of the army that has been finished. In 1976 the surveyors, who by then had stopped assuming anything, went looking to the sides and found 2 more pits. Pit 2 is the interesting one, the mixed force. Cavalry with their horses, chariots, kneeling archers and standing archers set in a formation that a chin officer would have read at a glance, and that we are still translating. Pit 3 is small, almost domestic by comparison, and it is the command post, around 68 figures, a chariot, a canopy, an arrangement that looks like a headquarters, and there is no general in it. The army has its officers and its chariots and its archers and its command tent, and the man who was supposed to be standing in the middle of that tent is simply not there, and never was. Nobody knows why. The most likely answers are dull, and the dull answers are usually right. Perhaps rank that high belonged only to the emperor. Perhaps the figure was made and never installed. It is a hole in the arrangement, and the arrangement is otherwise so obsessively complete that the whole hums a little. It is worth saying, gently, that this is what most archaeology actually feels like from the inside. Not revelation. Arrangement. A person with a trowel and a notebook working out that the 3rd rank is unarmoured and the 4th rank is not. and that the horses were placed before the chariot boxes, and that somebody in 200 and something before the Common Era stood in this trench in the cold and made a decision that we can still read in the spacing of the feet. The pleasure is cumulative and very quiet, and it arrives at the speed of a season, and then another season, and then a life. Yuan Zhongyi spent his in that field, and the field is not finished, and he knew it would not be, and he kept going anyway, which is a form of faith that does not require a religion. And then there is Pit 4. Pit 4 was dug and squared and prepared and left empty. There is nothing in it. The workers cut the trench and never filled it, because the dynasty ran out of time before the dynasty ran out of ambition, which is the usual order in which these things run out. It is, I think, the most eloquent hole in the world. Everything the first emperor believed about permanence is contradicted, quietly and without argument, by an empty rectangle in the lowest that nobody got round to finishing. The totals, when they were finally worked out, came to this: more than 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots, 520 chariot horses, and 150 cavalry horses. Every figure between about 1.75 meters and about 2 meters tall, with the officers taller than the men and the generals tallest of all, because in Qin sculpture rank was expressed by height, which is a convention, not a measurement. The Qin army was not staffed exclusively by unusually large men. It simply seemed simpler to whoever designed this to make importance visible from across a room, and one has to admit it works. But the army, it turned out, was only the garrison, because the pits with the soldiers in them sit about 1.5 kilometers east of the mound, and the necropolis around that mound covers roughly 56 square kilometers, and in that ground, decade after decade, the surveyors kept finding other rooms of the same buried house. There is a pit of acrobats and entertainers, catalogued with the flat poetry of archaeology as K9901, full of figures with soft bellies and bare arms and impossible postures, strongmen and jugglers and tumblers, modelled with a looseness the soldiers never got, because a soldier must be correct and an acrobat must be alive. There is a pit of bronze waterfowl, K7, in which 46 bronze cranes and swans and geese stand along a modelled watercourse, some with their heads down as if feeding, one with a small fish or a worm in its beak, arranged along an artificial stream so that the dead emperor might have somewhere pleasant to walk. There is a pit of stone armour, K9801, holding suit after suit of limestone plates drilled and laced together with wire, thousands of hours of stone cutting, producing armour that no living body could wear for 10 minutes without falling over. Armour for the dead, too heavy to be useful and far too carefully made to be cynical. And in 1980, about 20 metres west of the mound, they lifted out 2 half-scale bronze chariots, each assembled from thousands of separate parts, with turning axles, articulated harness, reins as fine as thread, a folding parasol that folds, and a driver with his sleeves modelled where they would have creased. They are among the finest bronzes ever cast anywhere by anybody, and they were made to be buried immediately. So put the whole plan together and see what it actually is. He was not given an army, he was given a world. A garrison to the east, entertainers for the evening, waterfowl on a stream, armour in the stores, offices, stables, a functioning bureaucracy, and a town called Liyi founded nearby entirely to keep the whole arrangement running. The Terracotta army is not a monument, it is a household. It is what a very literal man builds when he has been told that he will need everything again, and has decided to take that advice seriously, and has the entire tax base of a continent with which to take it seriously. Now, the mending. It is worth understanding what excavation here really is, because the word suggests discovery, and the reality is closer to needlework. When the roofs burned and fell, every figure in those pits went over. Every one. There is no intact army, and there never was one for us to find. What lies in the ground is a floor of fragments, and what the excavators do day after day for years is this. They clear a small area, and they photograph it, and they number every fragment where it lies, and they draw it. And they lift the pieces into trays, and they carry the trays to long tables under a high roof, and then they begin matching broken edges. A fracture surface is as individual as a fingerprint in its way. Two pieces either belong together or they do not. And the only way to know is to try, and the only way to try is by hand, and there are hundreds of pieces to a figure, and thousands of figures. A single warrior can take months. Some are worse. Some are missing pieces that burned, or were carried away, or are still lying under the section that has not been opened yet, and so a torso may wait on a table for 20 years for a shoulder that has not been dug up. Some warriors are on those tables tonight, in the dark, half assembled, waiting. Some will never be whole, and that means that every soldier standing in that great hall, every single one you have seen in a photograph, is a repair, not a survival, a repair. Somebody knelt for a season and gave that man his face back. The clay is chin, and the standing is entirely modern, and it seems to me that both halves of that sentence deserve equal credit. Then there is the colour, and the colour is the hardest part. Remember what these figures were: lacquered, then painted in cinnabar red and iron oxide red and malachite green and azurite blue and bone white, and that astonishing synthetic Hahn purple, the barium copper silicate that somebody in a chin workshop made on purpose without knowing what it was. They were not grey. They were loud. And when a painted figure is lifted out of the loess, the ground layer of lacquer, which has been quietly waterlogged for 2,200 years, meets the dry air of Shanxi and begins to curl. It shrinks. It lifts. And the paint, which is sitting on the lacquer rather than on the clay, comes away with it. In about 4 minutes, colour that waited 2,000 years can be gone in the time it takes to boil a kettle and think about the biscuits. That is not a figure of speech. It is a working conservation constraint, and it has shaped everything that has happened at Mount Lee since. So there is a fight, and it is a slow, unglamorous, thoroughly admirable fight. From the 1990s, the site museum has worked in a long partnership with conservators from Bavaria, and between them they have built a set of methods that sound like nothing at all, and are in fact heroic, keeping the surface humid from the moment it is exposed, spraying and wrapping so the lacquer never learns that the air has changed, then stabilizing it with polyethylene glycol consolidants, then curing that with radiation so that the whole fragile sandwich locks in place without ever being allowed to dry out first. It is a race whose finishing line is measured in minutes and whose training took years. And it works. Sometimes color is now sometimes saved. Sometimes it is not. There are warriors in that museum with green faces and pink faces and lacquer still lying in the folds of a sleeve, and there are many, many more that came up bright and went grey while somebody was walking across the pit. There is a particular kind of patience in that work which I would like you to carry into sleep with you. The conservators are not chasing a discovery. They already know what is down there, more or less, and they know that most of it will be lost anyway, and they go back the next morning and set up the humidifier and lay out the wrapping and try again. For a sleeve, for a collar, for a single surviving eyebrow of black lacquer on a face that has waited 2,200 years to be looked at. They save what they can, and they write down what they lose, and neither the saving nor the writing is dramatic, and both are the reason anything survives at all. Which brings us to the Mercury, and to the most important thing this whole long night has to say. We have spent hours tonight taking loud stories apart. We took apart the chrome-plated swords, gently, and found lacquer and good bronze and kind soil underneath. We took apart the 700,000 massacred slaves, and found conscripts and craftsmen and convicts and tiles with their names on. It would be easy, at this point, to fall into the comfortable habit of assuming that every dramatic claim about the ancient world is a story, and that the historians of long ago were simply fabulists with better sentences than facts. So let us not do that. because Sima Qian, the historian who never once mentioned 8,000 clay soldiers standing 1.5 kilometers from the tomb he described in loving detail, also wrote that the floor of that tomb held the empire in miniature with 100 waterways, the Yangtze and the Yellow River running in mercury made to flow by some mechanism he does not explain. And from 1981, when the first systematic soil survey went over that mound with instruments, the mercury was there. Not a trace. Not a rumour. A strong, sharply defined anomaly in the central part of the mound, running at something like 100 times the natural background of the surrounding earth, with edges and with a distribution that loosely, roughly, tantalizingly echoes the geography he described, heavier where the sea and the great rivers ought to be. And in 2020, a laser radar study detected mercury still venting quietly out of the hill, still evaporating, 2,200 years later into the air above a persimmon grove. So sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole lesson, and it is a restful one. The man who missed the most photogenic army in human history was telling the plain truth about the rivers of quicksilver. He was not a liar. He was not an eyewitness either. He was a person, working about a century after the fact, in a bureaucracy, writing down what reached him, some of it archived, some of it hearsay, some of it the sort of thing everybody knew and nobody had checked. Which, if we are honest, is all any of us is. That is why we debunk softly here, not because the truth does not matter, but because the wild story is sometimes the true one, and the only way to find out which is to go and look, patiently, with instruments, and to be willing to be wrong in either direction. The sword was not magic. The river was real. Nobody could have guessed which way round that would fall. And so, at last, to the room. The central chamber of the tomb of the first emperor has never been opened. Not once. Not in 2,200 years, and not in the 50-odd years since the head came up out of that well, with the whole apparatus of a modern state and the attention of the entire world available. It is still sealed tonight, while you are lying there, under about 76 metres of eroded earth that was perhaps 115 metres high when it was new. And this is not a failure of nerve, and it is not a lack of funding, and it is certainly not a lack of curiosity. It is a decision. Consider what they know. They know there is mercury down there in quantities that would make the excavation a poisoning as much as a dig. They know from the paint that they cannot yet keep what they would find, that the 4-minute problem is not solved, only fought to a draw, and that everything in that chamber which is lacquered, painted, silk or organic, would begin dying the moment the air arrived. Remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar and resistivity work suggest that the chamber is intact, unlooted, sitting there whole. And so the finest prize in archaeology is being deliberately left alone by the people who want to see it most, on the reasoning that a thing you destroy in the looking at is not a thing you have seen. They are waiting for a technology that does not exist. They are waiting for methods that have not been invented, but will be invented, if they are, by people who are not yet born. Which means that many of the archaeologists who have spent their whole lives at Mount Lai will die without ever knowing what is in the room they have stood on top of every working day. And they have agreed to that. I find that almost unbearably moving, and it is also the most perfect thought I could offer you tonight, that the greatest unopened room on earth is being permitted, on purpose, by patient and serious people, to keep on sleeping. Some things are allowed to keep sleeping. So let us go up, now, and look at all of it at once, and then let the whole thing settle. A boy became a king at 13, and started digging his grave the same year, and dug it for 38 years, and never finished it. He conquered 6 kingdoms and made a country that had not existed, and gave it 1 script, and 1 coin, and 1 weight, and 1 measure, and 1 axle width, so that every cart in the world could run in every rut in the world. He then spent the second half of his life in a state of quiet terror about death. He sent Xu Fu east over the sea for the elixir of immortality, and Xu Fu, being no fool, sailed off and never came back. He listened to alchemists who told him that the way to become permanent was to swallow cinnabar and mercury, and he swallowed it, and it very probably helped to kill him. He died at Shakyu at 49, on the road, on a tour undertaken partly to look for the medicine that was poisoning him, and his ministers hid the fact of it and drove him home to Xianyang behind carts of salted fish, so that the smell of the emperor would be mistaken for the smell of dinner. And then he got exactly what he asked for, in the way that these requests are always granted, sideways and with the details wrong. He is immortal. He is, by a very wide margin, the most visited dead man on earth. Something like 8 million people a year come to Lintong to stand at a railing and look at him, and not one of them can look at him, because he is in a room nobody has opened, and what they are actually looking at, for hours, in silence, with their hands on the rail, is the work of his labourers. They came for the emperor. They stay for the pottery. 15 years. That is how long the empire that was going to last 10,000 generations actually lasted after he took the title. The books he burned are gone, the palaces he built were burned in their turn, the walls were rebuilt by other men in other centuries, and the ones you photograph today are mostly Ming. The dynasty is a footnote with a long shadow. What survived was the workmanship. And here is the thing I would like to leave in your mind as you go under tonight, because I think it is the truest thing in this entire long story. Not one soldier's name is known. 8,000 men stand in that ground, each with his own ears, his own mouth, his own expression, and every one of them is anonymous, because they are not portraits of anybody with a name that was written down. But more than 80 of their makers' names are known. Gong from the palace workshops, Xianyang from the capital's own potteries. More than 80 distinct hands stamped and incised into the hem of a robe, the underside of an arm, the back of a leg. And we know them for the least sentimental reason imaginable. Nobody carved those names to honour anybody. The law required it so that a bad figure could be traced back to the man who made it, and the foreman could be fined. The names were a leash. The names were the state's way of keeping its thumb on the throat of every potter in Shaanxi. And that leash, that thumb, that dry administrative suspicion, is the only reason we know who made the Terracotta army. Bureaucracy remembered them by accident, because bureaucracy wanted somebody to blame. Which brings us back, one last time, to the man we started with, in the shed, in the cold, with the lamp low. Gongchang pressed a small stamp into wet clay at the bottom of a robe, in a place where nobody would look, because he did not want to be fined. That was the entire scope of his ambition on that particular evening. He was not making art. He was not making history. He was complying with a regulation, and then he probably washed his hands and ate his millet and went to bed. His name outlived the figure's paint. It outlived the roof. It outlived the fire, and the emperor, and the dynasty, and the Han and the Tang and the Song and the Ming and the Qing, and the very idea of an emperor. 2,200 years later, a person knelt in a trench with a soft brush and read it off the hem, in the dark, exactly where he left it. And so what is left in that field, on this ordinary night, is this. A sealed chamber under a green hill, with rivers of mercury on its floor, quietly breathing a little poison up into the persimmon trees. An empty, unfinished pit that nobody ever got round to filling. 6,000 men in pit 1, of whom 4,000 are still lying in the dark exactly as they fell. A hall of repairs standing, with their faces mended, tables of fragments waiting for shoulders, and, down among the ranks, a kneeling archer, the best preserved figure of them all, perfect after all this time for the least heroic reason in the world. He was low to the ground, and when the burning roof came down, it passed over his head. He survived because he never stood up. There is no lesson in that. I simply like it. History does not vanish. It sinks. It goes down quietly, layer by layer, under the millet and the wheat and the persimmon roots and the wells, and it stops being an event and becomes soil, and then people walk on it for 2,000 years without knowing, and grow their fruit in it, and bury their own dead in it, and only now and then, in a dry year, when the water has gone deep and the digging has to go deeper, does the ground hand a little of it back. It was never lost. It was only underneath. It is underneath you too, wherever you are lying, layer upon layer, all the way down, holding you up. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another long, quiet story waiting for you on the screen right now, and it will keep you company for as long as you need it to. If you enjoyed tonight, and only if you truly enjoyed it, you might leave a like, and you might subscribe, so that the lamp stays lit here for the next person who cannot sleep. Thank you for spending your night with me and with a workshop foreman who only wanted to avoid a fine. Let your breathing go long and slow now. Let the day go. Let the emperor stay in his sealed room, and let the archer keep kneeling, and let all of it keep sleeping under the hill. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.